Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom by William Croft. Colophon Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom was published in 1860 by Ellen Croft and William Croft. This ebook was produced for Standard eBooks by Howard G. Conant and is based on a transcription produced in 1996 by Judith Boss and distributed proofreaders for Project Gutenberg and on digital scans from the Internet Archive. The cover page is adapted from The Hunted Slaves, a painting completed in 1862 by Richard Ansdell. The cover and title pages feature the League Spartan and Sots Mill Gaudy typefaces created in 2014 and 2009 by the League of Movable Type. This edition was released on November 16, 2025, 5:26 p.m., and is based on revision 95D 4720. The first edition of this ebook was released on April 28, 2023, 4:30 a.m. You can check for updates to this ebook, view its revision history, or download it for different e-reading systems at standardbooks.org/ebooks/William Croft Ellen Croft /Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom. The volunteer-driven Standard eBooks project relies on readers like you to submit typos, corrections, and other improvements. Anyone can contribute at standardbooks.org. Uncopyright. May you do good and not evil. May you find forgiveness for yourself and forgive others. May you share freely, never taking more than you give. Copyright pages exist to tell you that you can't do something. Unlike them, this uncopyright page exists to tell you that the writing and artwork in this ebook are believed to be in the United States public domain. That is, they are believed to be free of copyright restrictions in the United States. The United States public domain represents our collective cultural heritage, and items in it are free for anyone in the United States to do almost anything at all with, without having to get permission. Copyright laws are different all over the world, and the source text or artwork in this ebook may still be copyrighted in other countries. If you're not located in the United States, you must check your local laws before using this ebook. Standard eBooks makes no representations regarding the copyright status of the source text or artwork in this ebook in any country other than the United States. Non-authorship activities performed on items that are in the public domain, so-called sweat of the brow, work, don't create a new copyright. That means that nobody can claim a new copyright on an item that is in the public domain for, among other things, work like digitization, markup, or typography. Regardless, the contributors to this ebook released their contributions under the terms in the CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain dedication, thus dedicating to the worldwide public domain all of the work they've done on this ebook, including but not limited to metadata, the title page, imprint, colophon, this uncopyright, and any changes or enhancements to, or markup on, the original text and artwork. This dedication doesn't change the copyright status of the source text or artwork. We make this dedication in the interest of enriching our global cultural heritage, to promote free and libre culture around the world, and to give back to the unrestricted culture that has given all of us so much. Table of Contents Landmarks. Endnotes. It is unlawful in the slave states for anyone of purely European descent to intermarry with a person of African extraction, though a white man may live with as many colored women as he pleases without materially damaging his reputation in Southern society. Right. I may state here that every man's slave is called boy till he is very old, then the more respectable slaveholders call him uncle. The women are all girls till they are aged, then they are called aunts. This is the reason why Mrs. Stowe calls her characters Uncle Tom, Aunt Chloe, Uncle Tiff, etc. Right? Slaves cannot breathe in England. If their lungs receive our air, that moment they are free, they touch our country, and their shackles fall. Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom, The Escape of William and Ellen Croft from Slavery. Imprint. This ebook is the product of many hours of hard work by volunteers for Standard eBooks, and builds on the hard work of other literature lovers made possible by the public domain. This particular ebook is based on a transcription from Project Gutenberg and on digital scans from the Internet Archive. The source text and artwork in this ebook are believed to be in the United States public domain. That is, they are believed to be free of copyright restrictions in the United States. They may still be copyrighted in other countries, so users located outside of the United States must check their local laws before using this ebook. The creators of, and contributors to, this ebook dedicate their contributions to the worldwide public domain via the terms in the CC 01.0 Universal Public Domain dedication. For full license information, see the uncopyright at the end of this ebook. Standard eBooks is a volunteer-driven project that produces ebook editions of public domain literature using modern typography, technology, and editorial standards, and distributes them free of cost. You can download this and other ebooks carefully produced for true book lovers at Standard Books.org. Part I God gave us only over beast, fish, fowl, dominion absolute, that right we hold by his donation. But man over man he made not laud. Such title to himself reserving, human left from human free. My wife and myself were born in different towns in the state of Georgia, which is one of the principal slave states. It is true, our condition as slaves was not by any means the worst, but the mere idea that we were held as chattels and deprived of all legal rights, the thought that we had to give up our hard earnings to a tyrant to enable him to live in idleness and luxury, the thought that we could not call the bones and sinews that God gave us our own, but above all, the fact that another man had the power to tear from our cradle the newborn babe and sell it in the shambles like a brute, and then scourge us if we dared to lift a finger to save it from such a fate, haunted us for years. But in December 1848, a plan suggested itself that proved quite successful, and in 8 days after it was first thought of we were free from the horrible trammels of slavery, rejoicing and praising God in the glorious sunshine of liberty. My wife's first master was her father, and her mother his slave, and the latter is still the slave of his widow. Notwithstanding my wife being of African extraction on her mother's side, she is almost white. In fact, she is so nearly so that the tyrannical old lady to whom she first belonged became so annoyed at finding her frequently mistaken for a child of the family that she gave her when 11 years of age to a daughter as a wedding present. This separated my wife from her mother, and also from several other dear friends. But the incessant cruelty of her old mistress made the change of owners or treatment so desirable that she did not grumble much at this cruel separation. It may be remembered that slavery in America is not at all confined to persons of any particular complexion. There are a very large number of slaves as white as anyone, but as the evidence of a slave is not admitted in court against a free white person, it is almost impossible for a white child, after having been kidnapped and sold into or reduced to slavery, in a part of the country where it is not known, as often is the case, ever to recover its freedom. I have myself conversed with several slaves who told me that their parents were white and free, but that they were stolen away from them and sold when quite young, as they could not tell their address, and also as the parents did not know what had become of their lost and dear little ones. Of course, all traces of each other were gone. The following facts are sufficient to prove that he who has the power, and is inhuman enough to trample upon the sacred rights of the weak, cares nothing for race or color. In March 1818, 3 ships arrived at New Orleans, bringing several hundred German emigrants from the province of Alsace, on the Lower Rhine. Among them were Daniel Muller and his 2 daughters, Dorothea and Salome, whose mother had died on the passage. Soon after his arrival, Muller, taking with him his 2 daughters, both young children, went up the river to Atacapas Parish to work on the plantation of John F. Miller. A few weeks later, his relatives, who had remained at New Orleans, learned that he had died of the fever of the country. They immediately sent for the 2 girls, but they had disappeared, and the relatives, notwithstanding repeated and persevering inquiries and researches, could find no traces of them. They were at length given up for dead. Dorothea was never again heard of, nor was anything known of Salome from 1818 till 1843. In the summer of that year, Madame Call, a German woman who had come over in the same ship with the Mullers, was passing through a street in New Orleans, and accidentally saw Salome in a wine shop, belonging to Louis Belmont, by whom she was held as a slave. Madame Call recognized her at once, and carried her to the house of another German woman, Mrs. Schubert, who was Salome's cousin and godmother, and who no sooner set eyes on her than, without having any intimation that the discovery had been previously made, she unhesitatingly exclaimed, "My God, here is the long-lost Salome Muller." The law reporter, in its account of this case, says, as many of the German emigrants of 1818 as could be gathered together were brought to the house of Mrs. Schubert, and every one of the number who had any recollection of the little girl upon the passage, or any acquaintance with her father and mother, immediately identified the woman before them as the long-lost Salome Muller. By all these witnesses, who appeared at the trial, the identity was fully established. The family resemblance in every feature was declared to be so remarkable that some of the witnesses did not hesitate to say that they should know her among 10,000, that they were as certain the plaintiff was Salome Mullah, the daughter of Daniel and Dorothea Mullah, as of their own existence. Among the witnesses who appeared in court was the midwife who had assisted at the birth of Salome. She testified to the existence of certain peculiar marks upon the body of the child, which were found, exactly as described, by the surgeons who were appointed by the court to make an examination for the purpose. There was no trace of African descent in any feature of Salome Mullah. She had long, straight, black hair, hazel eyes, thin lips, and a Roman nose. The complexion of her face and neck was as dark as that of the darkest brunette. It appears, however, that, during the 25 years of her servitude, she had been exposed to the sun's rays in the hot climate of Louisiana, with head and neck unsheltered, as is customary with the female slaves, while laboring in the cotton or the sugar field. Those parts of her person which had been shielded from the sun were comparatively white. Belmont, the pretended owner of the girl, had obtained possession of her by an act of sale from John F. Miller, the planter in whose service Salome's father died. This Miller was a man of consideration and substance, owning large sugar estates, and bearing a high reputation for honor and honesty, and for indulgent treatment of his slaves. It was testified on the trial that he had said to Belmont, a few weeks after the sale of Salome, that she was white, and had as much right to her freedom as anyone, and was only to be retained in slavery by care and kind treatment. The broker who negotiated the sale from Miller to Belmont in 1838 testified in court that he then thought, and still thought, that the girl was white. The case was elaborately argued on both sides, but was at length decided in favor of the girl, by the Supreme Court declaring that she was free and white, and therefore unlawfully held in bondage. The Rev. George Bond, of Virginia, in his Picture of Slavery, published in 1834, relates the case of a white boy who, at the age of 7, was stolen from his home in Ohio, tanned and stained in such a way that he could not be distinguished from a person of color, and then sold as a slave in Virginia. At the age of 20, he made his escape by running away, and happily succeeded in rejoining his parents. I have known worthless white people to sell their own free children into slavery, and as there are good-for-nothing white as well as colored persons everywhere, no one, perhaps, will wonder at such inhuman transactions, particularly in the southern states of America, where I believe there is a greater want of humanity and high principle amongst the whites than among any other civilized people in the world. I know that those who are not familiar with the working of the peculiar institution can scarcely imagine anyone so totally devoid of all natural affection as to sell his own offspring into returnless bondage. But Shakespeare, that great observer of human nature, says, with caution judge of probabilities, things deemed unlikely and impossible, experience often shows us to be true. My wife's new mistress was decidedly more humane than the majority of her class. My wife has always given her credit for not exposing her to many of the worst features of slavery. For instance, it is a common practice in the slave states for ladies, when angry with their maids, to send them to the Calaboose sugar house, or to some other place established for the purpose of punishing slaves, and have them severely flogged. And I am sorry it is a fact, that the villains to whom those defenseless creatures are sent, not only flog them as they are ordered, but frequently compel them to submit to the greatest indignity. Oh, if there is any one thing under the wide canopy of heaven, horrible enough to stir a man's soul, and to make his very blood boil, it is the thought of his dear wife, his unprotected sister, or his young and virtuous daughters, struggling to save themselves from falling a prey to such demons. It always appears strange to me that anyone who was not born a slaveholder, and steeped to the very core in the demoralizing atmosphere of the southern states, can in any way palliate slavery. It is still more surprising to see virtuous ladies looking with patience upon, and remaining indifferent to, the existence of a system that exposes nearly 2 millions of their own sex in the manner I have mentioned, and that too in a professedly free and Christian country. There is, however, great consolation in knowing that God is just, and will not let the oppressor of the weak, and the spoiler of the virtuous, escape unpunished here and hereafter. I believe a similar retribution to that which destroyed Sodom is hanging over the slaveholders. My sincere prayer is that they may not provoke God, by persisting in a reckless course of wickedness, to pour out his consuming wrath upon them. I must now return to our history. My old master had the reputation of being a very humane and Christian man, but he thought nothing of selling my poor old father and dear aged mother, at separate times, to different persons, to be dragged off never to behold each other again, till summoned to appear before the great tribunal of heaven. But, oh, what a happy meeting it will be on that day for those faithful souls. I say a happy meeting, because I never saw persons more devoted to the service of God than they. But how will the case stand with those reckless traffickers in human flesh and blood, who plunged the poisonous dagger of separation into those loving hearts which God had for so many years closely joined together, nay, sealed as it were with his own hands for the eternal courts of heaven? It is not for me to say what will become of those heartless tyrants. I must leave them in the hands of an all-wise and just God, who will, in his own good time, and in his own way, avenge the wrongs of his oppressed people. My old master also sold a dear brother and a sister, in the same manner as he did my father and mother. The reason he assigned for disposing of my parents, as well as of several other aged slaves, was that they were getting old, and would soon become valueless in the market, and therefore he intended to sell off all the old stock and buy in a young lot. A most disgraceful conclusion for a man to come to, who made such great professions of religion. This shameful conduct gave me a thorough hatred, not for true Christianity, but for slave-holding piety. My old master, then, wishing to make the most of the rest of his slaves, apprenticed a brother and myself out to learn trades, he to a blacksmith, and myself to a cabinet maker. If a slave has a good trade, he will let or sell for more than a person without one, and many slaveholders have their slaves taught trades on this account. But before our time expired, my old master wanted money. So he sold my brother, and then mortgaged my sister, a dear girl about 14 years of age, and myself, then about 16, to one of the banks, to get money to speculate in cotton. This we knew nothing of at the moment, but time rolled on, the money became due, my master was unable to meet his payments, so the bank had us placed upon the auction stand, and sold to the highest bidder. My poor sister was sold first. She was knocked down to a planter who resided at some distance in the country. Then I was called upon the stand. While the auctioneer was crying the bids, I saw the man that had purchased my sister getting her into a cot to take her to his home. I at once asked a slave friend who was standing near the platform to run and ask the gentleman if he would please to wait till I was sold, in order that I might have an opportunity of bidding her goodbye. He sent me word back that he had some distance to go, and could not wait. I then turned to the auctioneer, fell upon my knees, and humbly prayed him to let me just step down and bid my lost sister farewell. But instead of granting me this request, he grasped me by the neck and in a commanding tone of voice, and with a violent oath exclaimed, "Get up! You can do the wench no good, therefore there is no use in your seeing her." On rising, I saw the cot in which she sat moving slowly off, and as she clasped her hands with a grasp that indicated despair, and looked pitifully round towards me, I also saw the large silent tears trickling down her cheeks. She made a farewell bow, and buried her face in her lap. This seemed more than I could bear. It appeared to swell my aching heart to its utmost. But before I could fairly recover, the poor girl was gone, and I have never had the good fortune to see her from that day to this. Perhaps I should have never heard of her again, had it not been for the untiring efforts of my good old mother, who became free a few years ago by purchase, and after a great deal of difficulty, found my sister residing with a family in Mississippi. My mother at once wrote to me, informing me of the fact, and requesting me to do something to get her free. And I am happy to say that, partly by lecturing occasionally, and through the sale of an engraving of my wife in the disguise in which she escaped, together with the extreme kindness and generosity of Miss Burdett Coutts, Mr. George Richardson of Plymouth, and a few other friends, I have nearly accomplished this. It would be to me a great and ever-glorious achievement to restore my sister to our dear mother, from whom she was forcibly driven in early life. I was knocked down to the cashier of the bank to which we were mortgaged, and ordered to return to the cabinet shop where I previously worked. But the thought of the harsh auctioneer not allowing me to bid my dear sister farewell sent red-hot indignation darting like lightning through every vein. It quenched my tears, and appeared to set my brain on fire, and made me crave for power to avenge our wrongs. But alas, we were only slaves and had no legal rights. Consequently, we were compelled to smother our wounded feelings and crouch beneath the iron heel of despotism. I must now give the account of our escape, but before doing so, it may be well to quote a few passages from the fundamental laws of slavery, in order to give some idea of the legal as well as the social tyranny from which we fled. According to the law of Louisiana, a slave is one who is in the power of a master to whom he belongs. The master may sell him, dispose of his person, his industry, and his labor. He can do nothing, possess nothing, nor acquire anything but what must belong to his master. Civil Code, Art. 35. In South Carolina, it is expressed in the following language: slaves shall be deemed, sold, taken, reputed and judged in law to be chattels personal in the hands of their owners and possessors, and their executors, administrators, and assigns, to all intents, constructions, and purposes whatsoever. 2 Brevods Digest, 229. The Constitution of Georgia has the following art. Fa. Sec. 12. Any person who shall maliciously dismember or deprive a slave of life shall suffer such punishment as would be inflicted in case the like offense had been committed on a free white person, and on the like proof, except in case of insurrection of such slave, and unless such death should happen by accident in giving such slave moderate correction. Prince's Digest, 559. I have known slaves to be beaten to death, but as they died under moderate correction, it was quite lawful, and of course the murderers were not interfered with. If any slave, who shall be out of the house or plantation where such slave shall live, or shall be usually employed, or without some white person in company with such slave, shall refuse to submit to undergo the examination of any white person, let him be ever so drunk or crazy, it shall be lawful for such white person to pursue, apprehend, and moderately correct such slave. And if such slave shall assault and strike such white person, such slave may be lawfully killed. 2 Brevods Digest, 231. Provided always, says the law, that such striking be not done by the command and in the defense of the person or property of the owner, or other person having the government of such slave, in which case the slave shall be wholly excused. According to this law, if a slave, by the direction of his overseer, strike a white person who is beating said overseer's pig, the slave shall be wholly excused. But should the bondman, of his own accord, fight to defend his wife, or should his terrified daughter instinctively raise her hand and strike the wretch who attempts to violate her chastity, he or she shall, saith the model republican law, suffer death. From having been myself a slave for nearly 23 years, I am quite prepared to say that the practical working of slavery is worse than the odious laws by which it is governed. At an early age, we were taken by the persons who held us as property to Macon, the largest town in the interior of the state of Georgia, at which place we became acquainted with each other for several years before our marriage. In fact, our marriage was postponed for some time simply because one of the unjust and worse than pagan laws under which we lived compelled all children of slave mothers to follow their condition. That is to say, the father of the slave may be the president of the republic, but if the mother should be a slave at the infant's birth, the poor child is ever legally doomed to the same cruel fate. It is a common practice for gentlemen, if I may call them such, moving in the highest circles of society, to be the fathers of children by their slaves, whom they can and do sell with the greatest impunity. And the more pious, beautiful, and virtuous the girls are, the greater the price they bring, and that too for the most infamous purposes. Any man with money, let him be ever such a rough brute, can buy a beautiful and virtuous girl, and force her to live with him in a criminal connection. And as the law says a slave shall have no higher appeal than the mere will of the master, she cannot escape, unless it be by flight or death. In endeavoring to reconcile a girl to her fate, the master sometimes says that he would marry her if it was not unlawful. Point one, however, he will always consider her to be his wife, and will treat her as such, and she, on the other hand, may regard him as her lawful husband, and if they have any children, they will be free and well educated. I am in duty bound to add that while a great majority of such men care nothing for the happiness of the women with whom they live, nor for the children of whom they are the fathers, there are those to be found, even in that heterogeneous mass of licentious monsters, who are true to their pledges. But as the woman and her children are legally the property of the man, who stands in the anomalous relation to them of husband and father, as well as master, they are liable to be seized and sold for his debts, should he become involved. There are several cases on record where such persons have been sold and separated for life. I know of some myself, but I have only space to glance at one. I knew a very humane and wealthy gentleman that bought a woman, with whom he lived as his wife. They brought up a family of children, among whom were 3 nearly white, well-educated, and beautiful girls. On the father being suddenly killed, it was found that he had not left a will. But as the family had always heard him say that he had no surviving relatives, they felt that their liberty and property were quite secured to them, and knowing the insults to which they were exposed, now their protector was no more. They were making preparations to leave for a free state. But, poor creatures, they were soon sadly undeceived. A villain residing at a distance, hearing of the circumstance, came forward and swore that he was a relative of the deceased. And as this man bore, or assumed, Mr. Slater's name, the case was brought before one of those horrible tribunals, presided over by a second Judge Jeffreys, and calling itself a court of justice, but before whom no colored person, nor an abolitionist, was ever known to get his full rights. A verdict was given in favor of the plaintiff, whom the better portion of the community thought had willfully conspired to cheat the family. The heartless wretch not only took the ordinary property, but actually had the aged and friendless widow, and all her fatherless children, except Frank, a fine young man about 22 years of age, and Mary, a very nice girl, a little younger than her brother, brought to the auction stand and sold to the highest bidder. Mrs. Slater had cash enough that her husband and master left to purchase the liberty of herself and children, but on her attempting to do so, the pusillanimous scoundrel, who had robbed them of their freedom, claimed the money as his property, and, poor creature, she had to give it up. According to law, as will be seen hereafter, a slave cannot own anything. The old lady never recovered from her sad affliction. At the sale she was brought up first, and after being vulgarly criticized, in the presence of all her distressed family, was sold to a cotton planter, who said he wanted the proud old critter to go to his plantation, to look after the little woolly heads, while their mammas were working in the field. When the sale was over, then came the separation, and oh, deep was the anguish of that slave mother's heart, when called from her darlings forever to part. The poor mourning mother of reason bereft, soon ended her sorrows, and sank cold in death. Antoinette, the flower of the family, a girl who was much beloved by all who knew her, for her Christ-like piety, dignity of manner, as well as her great talents and extreme beauty, was bought by an uneducated and drunken slave dealer. I cannot give a more correct description of the scene when she was called from her brother to the stand than will be found in the following lines. Why stands she near the auction stand? That girl so young and fair, what brings her to this dismal place? Why stands she weeping there? Why does she raise that bitter cry? Why hangs her head with shame, as now the auctioneer's rough voice so rudely calls her name? But see, she grasps a manly hand, and in a voice so low as scarcely to be heard, she says, "My brother, must I go?" A moment's pause, then, midst a wail of agonizing woe, his answer falls upon the ear. "Yes, sister, you must go. No longer can my arm defend. No longer can I save my sister from the horrid fate that waits her as a slave. Blush, Christian, blush. For e'en the dark, untutored heathen see thy inconsistency, and lo, they scorn thy God and thee?" The low trader said to a kind lady who wished to purchase Antoinette out of his hands, "I reckon I'll not sell the smart critter for $10,000. I always wanted her for my own use." The lady, wishing to remonstrate with him, commenced by saying, "You should remember, sir, that there is a just God." Hoskins, not understanding Mrs. Huston, interrupted her by saying, "I does, and guess it's monstrous kind in him to send such likely niggers for our convenience." Mrs. Huston, finding that a long course of reckless wickedness, drunkenness, and vice had destroyed in Hoskins every noble impulse, left him. Antoinette, poor girl, also seeing that there was no help for her, became frantic. I can never forget her cries of despair when Hoskins gave the order for her to be taken to his house and locked in an upper room. On Hoskins entering the apartment, in a state of intoxication, a fearful struggle ensued. The brave Antoinette broke loose from him, pitched herself head foremost through the window, and fell upon the pavement below. Her bruised but unpolluted body was soon picked up. Restoratives brought, Dr. called in, but alas, it was too late. Her pure and noble spirit had fled away to be at rest in those realms of endless bliss, where the wicked cease from troubling, and the weary are at rest. Antoinette, like many other noble women who are deprived of liberty, still holds something sacred, something undefiled, some pledge and keepsake of their higher nature, and, like the diamond in the dock, retains some quenchless gleam of the celestial light. On Hoskins fully realizing the fact that his victim was no more, he exclaimed, "By thunder, I am a used-up man." The sudden disappointment and the loss of $2,000 was more than he could endure. So he drank more than ever, and in a short time died, raving mad with delirium tremens. The villain Slater said to Mrs. Huston, the kind lady who endeavored to purchase Antoinette from Hoskins, "Nobody needn't talk to me about buying them, all likely niggers, for I'm not going to sell 'em." "But Mary is rather delicate," said Mrs. Huston, "and being unaccustomed to hard work, cannot do you much service on a plantation." "I don't want her for the field," replied Slater, "but for another purpose." Mrs. Huston understood what this meant and instantly exclaimed, "Oh, but she is your cousin?" "The devil she is," said Slater, and added, "Do you mean to insult me, madam, by saying that I am related to niggers?" "No," replied Mrs. Huston, "I do not wish to offend you, sir. But wasn't Mr. Slater, Mary's father, your uncle?" "Yes, I calculate he was," said Slater, "but I want you and everybody to understand that I'm no kin to his niggers." "Oh, very well," said Mrs. Huston, adding, "Now what will you take for the poor girl?" "Nothin'," he replied, "for, as I said before, I'm not going to sell, so you needn't trouble yourself no more. If the critter behaves herself, I'll do as well by her as any man." Slater spoke up boldly, but his manner and sheepish look clearly indicated that his heart within him was at strife with such accursed gains, for he knew whose passions gave her life, whose blood ran in her veins. The monster led her from the door, he led her by the hand, to be his slave and paramour in a strange and distant land. Poor Frank and his sister were handcuffed together, and confined in prison. Their dear little twin brother and sister were sold, and taken where they knew not. But it often happens that misfortune causes those whom we counted dearest to shrink away, while it makes friends of those whom we least expected to take any interest in our affairs. Among the latter class, Frank found two comparatively new but faithful friends to watch the gloomy paths of the unhappy little twins. In a day or two after the sale, Slater had 2 fast horses put to a large light van, and placed in it a good many small but valuable things belonging to the distressed family. He also took with him Frank and Mary, as well as all the money for the spoil, and after treating all his low friends and bystanders, and drinking deeply himself, he started in high glee for his home in South Carolina. But they had not proceeded many miles before Frank and his sister discovered that Slater was too drunk to drive. But he, like most tipsy men, thought he was all right, and as he had with him some of the ruined family's best brandy and wine, such as he had not been accustomed to, and being a thirsty soul, he drank till the reins fell from his fingers, and in attempting to catch them, he tumbled out of the vehicle, and was unable to get up. Frank and Mary there and then contrived a plan by which to escape. As they were still handcuffed by one wrist each, they alighted, took from the drunken assassin's pocket the key, undid the iron bracelets, and placed them upon Slater, who was better fitted to wear such ornaments. As the demon lay unconscious of what was taking place, Frank and Mary took from him the large sum of money that was realized at the sale, as well as that which Slater had so very meanly obtained from their poor mother. They then dragged him into the woods, tied him to a tree, and left the inebriated robber to shift for himself, while they made good their escape to Savannah. The fugitives being white, of course no one suspected that they were slaves. Slater was not able to call anyone to his rescue till late the next day, and as there were no railroads in that part of the country at that time, it was not until late the following day that Slater was able to get a party to join him for the chase. A person informed Slater that he had met a man and woman, in a trap, answering to the description of those whom he had lost, driving furiously towards Savannah. So Slater and several slave hunters on horseback started off in full tilt, with their bloodhounds, in pursuit of Frank and Mary. On arriving at Savannah, the hunters found that the fugitives had sold the horses and trap, and embarked as free white persons for New York. Slater's disappointment and rascality so preyed upon his base mind that he, like Judas, went and hanged himself. As soon as Frank and Mary were safe, they endeavored to redeem their good mother. But alas, she was gone. She had passed on to the realm of spirit life. In due time, Frank learned from his friends in Georgia where his little brother and sister dwelt. So he wrote at once to purchase them, but the persons with whom they lived would not sell them. After failing in several attempts to buy them, Frank cultivated large whiskers and moustachios, cut off his hair, put on a wig and glasses, and went down as a white man, and stopped in the neighborhood where his sister was, and after seeing her and also his little brother, arrangements were made for them to meet at a particular place on a Sunday, which they did, and got safely off. I saw Frank myself when he came for the little twins. Though I was then quite a lad, I well remember being highly delighted by hearing him tell how nicely he and Mary had served Slater. Frank had so completely disguised or changed his appearance that his little sister did not know him, and would not speak till he showed their mother's likeness, the sight of which melted her to tears, for she knew the face. Frank might have said to her, "Oh, Emma, oh, my sister, speak to me. Dost thou not know me, that I am thy brother? Come to me, little Emma, thou shalt dwell with me henceforth, and know no care or want." Emma was silent for a space, as if 'twere hard to summon up a human voice. Frank and Mary's mother was my wife's own dear aunt. After this great diversion from our narrative, which I hope, dear reader, you will excuse, I shall return at once to it. My wife was torn from her mother's embrace in childhood and taken to a distant part of the country. She had seen so many other children separated from their parents in this cruel manner, that the mere thought of her ever becoming the mother of a child, to linger out a miserable existence under the wretched system of American slavery, appeared to fill her very soul with horror. And as she had taken what I felt to be an important view of her condition, I did not, at first, press the marriage, but agreed to assist her in trying to devise some plan by which we might escape from our unhappy condition, and then be married. We thought of plan after plan, but they all seemed crowded with insurmountable difficulties. We knew it was unlawful for any public conveyance to take us as passengers, without our master's consent. We were also perfectly aware of the startling fact that had we left without this consent, the professional slave hunters would have soon had their ferocious bloodhounds baying on our track, and in a short time we should have been dragged back to slavery, not to fill the more favorable situations which we had just left, but to be separated for life, and put to the very meanest and most laborious drudgery, or else have been tortured to death as examples, in order to strike terror into the hearts of others, and thereby prevent them from even attempting to escape from their cruel taskmasters. It is a fact worthy of remark that nothing seems to give the slaveholders so much pleasure as the catching and torturing of fugitives. They had much rather take the keen and poisonous lash, and with it cut their poor trembling victims to atoms, than allow one of them to escape to a free country, and expose the infamous system from which he fled. The greatest excitement prevails at a slave hunt. The slaveholders and their hired ruffians appear to take more pleasure in this inhuman pursuit than English sportsmen do in chasing a fox or a stag. Therefore, knowing what we should have been compelled to suffer, if caught and taken back, we were more than anxious to hit upon a plan that would lead us safely to a land of liberty. But, after puzzling our brains for years, we were reluctantly driven to the sad conclusion that it was almost impossible to escape from slavery in Georgia and travel 1,000 miles across the slave states. We therefore resolved to get the consent of our owners, be married, settle down in slavery, and endeavor to make ourselves as comfortable as possible under that system, but at the same time ever to keep our dim eyes steadily fixed upon the glimmering hope of liberty, and earnestly pray God mercifully to assist us to escape from our unjust thraldom. We were married, and prayed and toiled on till December 1848, at which time, as I have stated, a plan suggested itself that proved quite successful, and in 8 days after it was first thought of we were free from the horrible trammels of slavery, and glorifying God who had brought us safely out of a land of bondage. Knowing that slaveholders have the privilege of taking their slaves to any part of the country they think proper, it occurred to me that, as my wife was nearly white, I might get her to disguise herself as an invalid gentleman and assume to be my master, while I could attend as his slave, and that in this manner we might effect our escape. After I thought of the plan, I suggested it to my wife, but at first she shrank from the idea. She thought it was almost impossible for her to assume that disguise and travel a distance of 1,000 miles across the slave states. However, on the other hand, she also thought of her condition. She saw that the laws under which we lived did not recognize her to be a woman, but a mere chattel, to be bought and sold, or otherwise dealt with as her owner might see fit. Therefore, the more she contemplated her helpless condition, the more anxious she was to escape from it. So she said, "I think it is almost too much for us to undertake. However, I feel that God is on our side, and with his assistance, notwithstanding all the difficulties, we shall be able to succeed. Therefore, if you will purchase the disguise, I will try to carry out the plan." But after I concluded to purchase the disguise, I was afraid to go to anyone to ask him to sell me the articles. It is unlawful in Georgia for a white man to trade with slaves without the master's consent. But, notwithstanding this, many persons will sell a slave any article that he can get the money to buy. Not that they sympathize with the slave, but merely because his testimony is not admitted in court against a free white person. Therefore, with little difficulty, I went to different parts of the town, at odd times, and purchased things piece by piece, except the trousers which she found necessary to make, and took them home to the house where my wife resided. She, being a lady's maid, and a favorite slave in the family, was allowed a little room to herself, and amongst other pieces of furniture which I had made in my overtime, was a chest of drawers. So when I took the articles home, she locked them up carefully in these drawers. No one about the premises knew that she had anything of the kind, so when we fancied we had everything ready, the time was fixed for the flight, but we knew it would not do to start off without first getting our master's consent to be away for a few days. Had we left without this, they would soon have had us back into slavery, and probably we should never have got another fair opportunity of even attempting to escape. Some of the best slaveholders will sometimes give their favorite slaves a few days' holiday at Christmas time. So, after no little amount of perseverance on my wife's part, she obtained a pass from her mistress, allowing her to be away for a few days. The cabinet maker with whom I worked gave me a similar paper, but said that he needed my services very much, and wished me to return as soon as the time granted was up. I thanked him kindly, but somehow I have not been able to make it convenient to return yet, and as the free air of good old England agrees so well with my wife and our dear little ones, as well as with myself, it is not at all likely we shall return at present to the peculiar institution of chains and stripes. On reaching my wife's cottage, she handed me her pass, and I showed mine, but at that time neither of us were able to read them. It is not only unlawful for slaves to be taught to read, but in some of the states there are heavy penalties attached, such as fines and imprisonment, which will be vigorously enforced upon anyone who is humane enough to violate the so-called law. The following case will serve to show how persons are treated in the most enlightened slaveholding community. Indictment, Commonwealth of Virginia, Norfolk County, SS. In the circuit, caught the grand jurors impaneled in the body of the said county on their oath present, that Margaret Douglas, being an evil-disposed person, not having the fear of God before her eyes, but moved and instigated by the devil, wickedly, maliciously, and feloniously, on the 4th day of July, in the year of our Lord 1854, at Norfolk, in said county, did teach a certain black girl named Kate to read in the Bible, to the great displeasure of Almighty God, to the pernicious example of others in like case offending, contrary to the form of the statute in such case made and provided, and against the peace and dignity of the Commonwealth of Virginia. Victor Vagabond, prosecuting attorney on this indictment, Mrs. Douglas was arraigned as a necessary matter of form, tried, found guilty of cause, and Judge Scalaway, before whom she was tried, having consulted with Dr. Adams, ordered the sheriff to place Mrs. Douglas in the prisoner's box, when he addressed her as follows: "Margaret Douglas, stand up. You are guilty of one of the vilest crimes that ever disgraced society, and the jury have found you so. You have taught a slave girl to read in the Bible. No enlightened society can exist where such offenses go unpunished. The court, in your case, do not feel for you one solitary ray of sympathy, and they will inflict on you the utmost penalty of the law. In any other civilized country, you would have paid the forfeit of your crime with your life, and the court have only to regret that such is not the law in this country. The sentence for your offense is, that you be imprisoned 1 month in the county jail, and that you pay the costs of this prosecution. Sheriff, remove the prisoner to jail." On the publication of these proceedings, the doctors of divinity preached each a sermon on the necessity of obeying the laws. The New York Observer noticed with much pious gladness a revival of religion on Dr. Smith's plantation in Georgia, among his slaves, while the Journal of Commerce commended this political preaching of the doctors of divinity because it favored slavery. Let us do nothing to offend our Southern brethren. However, at first we were highly delighted at the idea of having gained permission to be absent for a few days, but when the thought flashed across my wife's mind that it was customary for travelers to register their names in the visitor's book at hotels, as well as in the clearance or custom house book at Charleston, South Carolina, it made our spirits droop within us. So, while sitting in our little room upon the verge of despair, all at once my wife raised her head, and with a smile upon her face, which was a moment before bathed in tears, said, "I think I have it." I asked what it was. She said, "I think I can make a poultice and bind up my right hand in a sling, and with propriety ask the officers to register my name for me." I thought that would do. It then occurred to her that the smoothness of her face might betray her, so she decided to make another poultice, and put it in a white handkerchief to be worn under the chin, up the cheeks, and to tie over the head. This nearly hid the expression of the countenance as well as the beardless chin. The poultice is left off in the engraving because the likeness could not have been taken well with it on. My wife, knowing that she would be thrown a good deal into the company of gentlemen, fancied that she could get on better if she had something to go over the eyes, so I went to a shop and bought a pair of green spectacles. This was in the evening. We sat up all night discussing the plan and making preparations. Just before the time arrived, in the morning, for us to leave, I cut off my wife's hair square at the back of the head and got her to dress in the disguise and stand out on the floor. I found that she made a most respectable-looking gentleman. My wife had no ambition whatever to assume this disguise, and would not have done so had it been possible to have obtained our liberty by more simple means. But we knew it was not customary in the South for ladies to travel with male servants, and therefore, notwithstanding my wife's fair complexion, it would have been a very difficult task for her to have come off as a free white lady, with me as her slave. In fact, her not being able to write would have made this quite impossible. We knew that no public conveyance would take us, or any other slave, as a passenger, without our master's consent. This consent could never be obtained to pass into a free state. My wife's being muffled in the poultices, etc., furnished a plausible excuse for avoiding general conversation, of which most Yankee travelers are passionately fond. There are a large number of free Negroes residing in the southern states, but in Georgia, and I believe in all the slave states, every colored person's complexion is prima facie evidence of his being a slave, and the lowest villain in the country, should he be a white man, has the legal power to arrest and question, in the most inquisitorial and insulting manner, any colored person, male or female, that he may find at large, particularly at night and on Sundays, without a written pass, signed by the master or someone in authority, or stamped free papers, certifying that the person is the rightful owner of himself. If the colored person refuses to answer questions put to him, he may be beaten, and his defending himself against this attack makes him an outlaw, and if he be killed on the spot, the murderer will be exempted from all blame. But after the colored person has answered the questions put to him, in a most humble and pointed manner, he may then be taken to prison. And should it turn out, after further examination, that he was caught where he had no permission or legal right to be, and that he has not given what they term a satisfactory account of himself, the master will have to pay a fine. On his refusing to do this, the poor slave may be legally and severely flogged by public officers. Should the prisoner prove to be a free man, he is most likely to be both whipped and fined. The great majority of slaveholders hate this class of persons with a hatred that can only be equaled by the condemned spirits of the infernal regions. They have no mercy upon, nor sympathy for, any Negro whom they cannot enslave. They say that God made the black man to be a slave for the white, and act as though they really believed that all free persons of color are in open rebellion to a direct command from heaven, and that they, the whites, are God's chosen agents to pour out upon them unlimited vengeance. For instance, a bill has been introduced in the Tennessee legislature to prevent free Negroes from traveling on the railroads in that state. It has passed the first reading. The bill provides that the president who shall permit a free Negro to travel on any road within the jurisdiction of the state under his supervision shall pay a fine of $500. Any conductor permitting a violation of the act shall pay $250, provided such free Negro is not under the control of a free white citizen of Tennessee, who will vouch for the character of said free Negro in a penal bond of $1,000. The state of Arkansas has passed a law to banish all free Negroes from its bounds, and it came into effect on the 1st day of January, 1860. Every free Negro found there after that date will be liable to be sold into slavery, the crime of freedom being unpardonable. The Missouri Senate has before it a bill providing that all free Negroes above the age of 18 years who shall be found in the state after September 1860 shall be sold into slavery, and that all such Negroes as shall enter the state after September 1861 and remain there 24 hours shall also be sold into slavery forever. Mississippi, Kentucky, and Georgia, and in fact, I believe, all the slave states are legislating in the same manner. Thus, the slaveholders make it almost impossible for free persons of color to get out of the slave states, in order that they may sell them into slavery if they don't go. If no white persons traveled upon railroads, except those who could get someone to vouch for their character in a penal bond of $1,000, the railroad companies would soon go to the wall. Such mean legislation is too low for comment, therefore I leave the villainous acts to speak for themselves. But the Dred Scott decision is the crowning act of infamous Yankee legislation. The Supreme Court, the highest tribunal of the Republic, composed of 9 Judge Jeffreyses, chosen both from the free and slave states, has decided that no colored person, or persons of African extraction, can ever become a citizen of the United States, or have any rights which white men are bound to respect. That is to say, in the opinion of this court, robbery, rape, and murder are not crimes when committed by a white upon a colored person. Judges who will sneak from their high and honorable position down into the lowest depths of human depravity and scrape up a decision like this are wholly unworthy the confidence of any people. I believe such men would, if they had the power, and were it to their temporal interest, sell their country's independence and barter away every man's birthright for a mess of pottage. Well may Thomas Campbell say, United States, your banner wears 2 emblems, one of fame, alas, the other that it bears reminds us of your shame. The white man's liberty in types stands blazoned by your stars, but what's the meaning of your stripes? They mean your Negro scars. When the time had arrived for us to start, we blew out the lights, knelt down, and prayed to our Heavenly Father mercifully to assist us, as he did his people of old, to escape from cruel bondage, and we shall ever feel that God heard and answered our prayer. Had we not been sustained by a kind, and I sometimes think special, providence, we could never have overcome the mountainous difficulties which I am now about to describe. After this, we rose and stood for a few moments in breathless silence. We were afraid that someone might have been about the cottage listening and watching our movements. So I took my wife by the hand, stepped softly to the door, raised the latch, drew it open, and peeped out. Though there were trees all around the house, yet the foliage scarcely moved. In fact, everything appeared to be as still as death. I then whispered to my wife, "Come, my dear, let us make a desperate leap for liberty." But poor thing, she shrank back, in a state of trepidation. I turned and asked what was the matter. She made no reply, but burst into violent sobs and threw her head upon my breast. This appeared to touch my very heart. It caused me to enter into her feelings more fully than ever. We both saw the many mountainous difficulties that rose one after the other before our view, and knew far too well what our sad fate would have been, were we caught and forced back into our slavish den. Therefore, on my wife's fully realizing the solemn fact that we had to take our lives, as it were, in our hands, and contest every inch of the 1,000 miles of slave territory over which we had to pass, it made her heart almost sink within her, and had I known them at that time, I would have repeated the following encouraging lines, which may not be out of place here. The hill, though high, I covet to ascend, the difficulty will not me offend, for I perceive the way to life lies here. Come, pluck up heart, let's neither faint nor fear. Better, though difficult, the right way to go, than wrong, though easy, where the end is woe. However, the sobbing was soon over, and after a few moments of silent prayer she recovered her self-possession and said, "Come, William, it is getting late, so now let us venture upon our perilous journey." We then opened the door and stepped as softly out as moonlight upon the water. I locked the door with my own key, which I now have before me, and tiptoed across the yard into the street. I say tiptoed, because we were like persons near a tottering avalanche, afraid to move, or even breathe freely, for fear the sleeping tyrants should be aroused, and come down upon us with double vengeance, for daring to attempt to escape in the manner which we contemplated. We shook hands, said farewell, and started in different directions for the railway station. I took the nearest possible way to the train, for fear I should be recognized by someone, and got into the Negro car in which I knew I should have to ride. But my master, as I will now call my wife, took a longer way round, and only arrived there with the bulk of the passengers. He obtained a ticket for himself and one for his slave to Savannah, the first pot, which was about 200 miles off. My master then had the luggage stowed away, and stepped into one of the best carriages. But just before the train moved off, I peeped through the window, and to my great astonishment, I saw the cabinet maker with whom I had worked so long on the platform. He stepped up to the ticket seller and asked some question, and then commenced looking rapidly through the passengers and into the carriages. Fully believing that we were caught, I shrank into a corner, turned my face from the door, and expected in a moment to be dragged out. The cabinet maker looked into my master's carriage, but did not know him in his new attire, and, as God would have it, before he reached mine the bell rang, and the train moved off. I have heard since that the cabinet maker had a presentiment that we were about to make tracks for parts unknown, but not seeing me, His suspicions vanished, until he received the startling intelligence that we had arrived freely in a free state. As soon as the train had left the platform, my master looked round in the carriage, and was terror-stricken to find a Mr. Cray, an old friend of my wife's master, who dined with the family the day before, and knew my wife from childhood, sitting on the same seat. The doors of the American railway carriages are at the ends. The passengers walk up the aisle, and take seats on either side, and as my master was engaged in looking out of the window, he did not see who came in. My master's first impression, after seeing Mr. Cray, was that he was there for the purpose of securing him. However, my master thought it was not wise to give any information respecting himself, and for fear that Mr. Cray might draw him into conversation and recognize his voice, my master resolved to feign deafness as the only means of self-defense. After a little while, Mr. Cray said to my master, "It is a very fine morning, sir." The latter took no notice, but kept looking out of the window. Mr. Cray soon repeated this remark, in a little louder tone, but my master remained as before. This indifference attracted the attention of the passengers near, one of whom laughed out. This, I suppose, annoyed the old gentleman, so he said, "I will make him hear," and in a loud tone of voice repeated, "It is a very fine morning, sir." My master turned his head and with a polite bow said, "Yes," and commenced looking out of the window again. One of the gentlemen remarked that it was a very great deprivation to be deaf. "Yes," replied Mr. Cray, "and I shall not trouble that fellow any more." This enabled my master to breathe a little easier, and to feel that Mr. Cray was not his pursuer after all. The gentleman then turned the conversation upon the three great topics of discussion in first-class circles in Georgia, namely, niggers, cotton, and the abolitionists. My master had often heard of abolitionists, but in such a connection as to cause him to think that they were a fearful kind of wild animal. But he was highly delighted to learn, from the gentleman's conversation, that the abolitionists were persons who were opposed to oppression, and therefore, in his opinion, not the lowest, but the very highest of God's creatures. Without the slightest objection on my master's part, the gentleman left the carriage at Gaudin, for Milledgeville, the capital of the state. We arrived at Savannah early in the evening, and got into an omnibus, which stopped at the hotel for the passengers to take tea. I stepped into the house and brought my master something on a tray to the omnibus, which took us in due time to the steamer, which was bound for Charleston, South Carolina. Soon after going on board, my master turned in, and as the captain and some of the passengers seemed to think this strange, and also questioned me respecting him, my master thought I had better get out the flannels and opodeldoc which we had prepared for the rheumatism, warm them quickly by the stove in the gentleman's saloon, and bring them to his berth. We did this as an excuse for my master's retiring to bed so early. While at the stove, one of the passengers said to me, "Buck, what have you got there?" "Opodeldoc, sir," I replied. "I should think it's opodevil," said a lanky swell, who was leaning back in a chair with his heels upon the back of another, and chewing tobacco as if for a wager. "It stinks enough to kill or cure 20 men. Away with it, or I reckon I will throw it overboard." It was by this time warm enough, so I took it to my master's berth, remained there a little while, and then went on deck and asked the steward where I was to sleep. He said there was no place provided for colored passengers, whether slave or free. So I paced the deck till a late hour, then mounted some cotton bags in a warm place near the funnel, sat there till morning, and then went and assisted my master to get ready for breakfast. He was seated at the right hand of the captain, who, together with all the passengers, inquired very kindly after his health. As my master had one hand in a sling, it was my duty to carve his food. But when I went out, the captain said, "You have a very attentive boy, sir, but you had better watch him like a hawk when you get on to the north. He seems all very well here, but he may act quite differently there. I know several gentlemen who have lost their valuable niggers, among them D. cutthroat abolitionists." Before my master could speak, a rough slave dealer, who was sitting opposite, with both elbows on the table, and with a large piece of broiled fowl in his fingers, shook his head with emphasis, and in a deep Yankee tone, forced through his crowded mouth the words, "Sound doctrine, Captain, very sound." He then dropped the chicken into the plate, leant back, placed his thumbs in the armholes of his fancy waistcoat, and continued, "I would not take a nigger to the north under no consideration. I have had a deal to do with niggers in my time, but I never saw one who ever had his heel upon free soil that was worth a D.N. Now, stranger," addressing my master, "if you have made up your mind to sell that nigger, I am your man. Just mention your price, and if it isn't out of the way, I will pay for him on this board with hard silver dollars." This hard-featured, bristly-bearded, wire-headed, red-eyed monster, staring at my master as the serpent did at Eve, said, "What do you say, stranger?" He replied, "I don't wish to sell, sir. I cannot get on well without him." "You will have to get on without him if you take him to the north," continued this man. "For I can tell ye, stranger, as a friend, I am an older cove than you. I have seen lots of this air world, and I reckon I have had more dealings with niggers than any man living or dead. I was once employed by General Wade Hampton, for 10 years, in doing nothing but breaking 'em in. And everybody knows that the general would not have a man that didn't understand his business. So I tell ye, stranger, again, you had better sell, and let me take him down to Orleans. He will do you no good if you take him across Mason's and Dixon's line. He is a keen nigger, and I can see from the cut of his eye that he is certain to run away." My master said, "I think not, sir. I have great confidence in his fidelity." "Fideville," indignantly said the dealer, as his fist came down upon the edge of the saucer and upset a cup of hot coffee in a gentleman's lap. As the scalded man jumped up, the trader quietly said, "Don't disturb yourself, neighbor. Accidents will happen in the best of families. It always makes me mad to hear a man talking about fidelity in niggers. There isn't a D one on him who wouldn't cut sticks if he had half a chance." By this time we were near Charleston. My master thanked the captain for his advice, and they all withdrew and went on deck, where the trader fancied he became quite eloquent. He drew a crowd around him, and with emphasis said, "Cap'n, if I was the president of this mighty United States of America, the greatest and freest country under the whole universe, I would never let no man, I don't care who he is, take a nigger into the north and bring him back here, filled to the brim, as he is sure to be, with abolition vices, to taint all quiet niggers with the hellish spirit of running away. These Cap'n, my flat-footed, every day, right up and down sentiments, and as this is a free country, Cap'n, I don't care who hears 'em, for I am a Southern man, every inch on me to the backbone." "Good," said an insignificant-looking individual of the slave dealer stamp. "3 cheers for John C. Calhoun and the whole fair sunny South," added the trader. So off went their hats, and out burst a terrific roar of irregular, but continued cheering. My master took no more notice of the dealer. He merely said to the captain that the air on deck was too keen for him, and he would therefore return to the cabin. While the trader was in the zenith of his eloquence, he might as well have said, as one of his kit did, at a great filibustering meeting, that when the great American eagle gets one of his mighty claws upon Canada and the other into South America, and his glorious and starry wings of liberty extending from the Atlantic to the Pacific, oh, then, where will England be? Ye gentlemen, I tell ye, she will only serve as a pocket handkerchief for Jonathan to wipe his nose with. On my master entering the cabin, he found at the breakfast table a young Southern military officer with whom he had traveled some distance the previous day. After passing the usual compliments, the conversation turned upon the old subject, niggers. The officer, who was also traveling with a manservant, said to my master, "You will excuse me, sir, for saying I think you are very likely to spoil your boy by saying thank you to him. I assure you, sir, nothing spoils a slave so soon as saying, thank you and if you please to him. The only way to make a nigger toe the mark and to keep him in his place is to storm at him like thunder and keep him trembling like a leaf. Don't you see when I speak to my Ned, he darts like lightning, and if he didn't I'd skin him." Just then the poor dejected slave came in, and the officer swore at him fearfully, merely to teach my master what he called the proper way to treat me. After he had gone out to get his master's luggage ready, the officer said, "That is the way to speak to them. If every nigger was drilled in this manner, they would be as humble as dogs, and never dare to run away." The gentleman urged my master not to go to the north for the restoration of his health, but to visit the warm springs in Arkansas. My master said he thought the air of Philadelphia would suit his complaint best, and not only so, he thought he could get better advice there. The boat had now reached the wharf. The officer wished my master a safe and pleasant journey and left the saloon. There were a large number of persons on the quay waiting the arrival of the steamer, but we were afraid to venture out for fear that someone might recognize me, or that they had heard that we were gone, and had telegraphed to have us stopped. However, after remaining in the cabin till all the other passengers were gone, we had our luggage placed on a fly, and I took my master by the arm, and with a little difficulty he hobbled on shore, got in, and drove off to the best hotel, which John C. Calhoun and all the other great Southern fire-eating statesmen made their headquarters while in Charleston. On arriving at the house, the landlord ran out and opened the door, but judging, from the poultices and green glasses, that my master was an invalid, He took him very tenderly by one arm and ordered his man to take the other. My master then eased himself out, and with their assistance found no trouble in getting up the steps into the hotel. The proprietor made me stand on one side, while he paid my master the attention and homage he thought a gentleman of his high position merited. My master asked for a bedroom. The servant was ordered to show a good one, into which we helped him. The servant returned. My master then handed me the bandages. I took them downstairs in great haste, and told the landlord my master wanted 2 hot poultices as quickly as possible. He rang the bell. The servant came in, to whom he said, "Run to the kitchen and tell the cook to make 2 hot poultices right off, for there is a gentleman upstairs very badly off indeed." In a few minutes the smoking poultices were brought in. I placed them in white handkerchiefs, and hurried upstairs, went into my master's apartment, shut the door, and laid them on the mantelpiece. As he was alone for a little while, he thought he could rest a great deal better with the poultices off. However, it was necessary to have them to complete the remainder of the journey. I then ordered dinner, and took my master's boots out to polish them. While doing so, I entered into conversation with one of the slaves. I may state here that on the seacoast of South Carolina and Georgia, the slaves speak worse English than in any other part of the country. This is owing to the frequent importation, or smuggling in, of Africans, who mingle with the natives. Consequently, the language cannot properly be called English or African, but a corruption of the two. The shrewd son of African parents to whom I referred said to me, "Say, brudder, where you come from, and which side you goin' day wid dat little done-up buckra, white man?" I replied, "To Philadelphia." "What?" he exclaimed with astonishment, "to Philadelphia?" "Yes," I said. "By squash, I wish I was going wid you. I hears say dat dere's no slaves way over in dem pots is so." I quietly said, "I have heard the same thing." "Well," continued he, as he threw down the boot and brush and, placing his hands in his pockets, strutted across the floor with an air of independence. "Goramighty, dem is de pots for Pompey, and I hope when you get dere you will stay, and nebber follow dat buckra back to dis hot quarter no more, let him be ebber so good." I thanked him, and just as I took the boots up and started off, he caught my hand between his two and gave it a hearty shake, and with tears streaming down his cheeks said, "God bless you, broda, and may de Lord be wid you. When you gets to freedom, and sittin' under your own wine and fig tree, don't forget to pray for poor Pompey." I was afraid to say much to him, but I shall never forget his earnest request, nor fail to do what little I can to release the millions of unhappy bondmen, of whom he was one. At the proper time, my master had the poultices placed on, came down, and seated himself at a table in a very brilliant dining room to have his dinner. I had to have something at the same time, in order to be ready for the boat, so they gave me my dinner in an old broken plate, with a rusty knife and fork, and said, "Here, boy, you go in the kitchen." I took it and went out, but did not stay more than a few minutes, because I was in a great hurry to get back to see how the invalid was getting on. On arriving, I found 2 or 3 servants waiting on him, but as he did not feel able to make a very hearty dinner, he soon finished, paid the bill, and gave the servants each a trifle, which caused one of them to say to me, "Your masser is a big bug," meaning a gentleman of distinction. "He is the greatest gentleman dat has been dis way for dis 6 months." I said, "Yes, he is some pumpkins," meaning the same as big bug. When we left Macon, it was our intention to take a steamer at Charleston through to Philadelphia, but on arriving there, we found that the vessels did not run during the winter, and I have no doubt it was well for us they did not. For on the very last voyage the steamer made that we intended to go by, a fugitive was discovered secreted on board, and sent back to slavery. However, as we had also heard of the overland mail route, we were all right. So I ordered a fly to the door, had the luggage placed on. We got in, and drove down to the custom house office, which was near the wharf where we had to obtain tickets, to take a steamer for Wilmington, North Carolina. When we reached the building, I helped my master into the office, which was crowded with passengers. He asked for a ticket for himself and one for his slave to Philadelphia. This caused the principal officer, a very mean-looking, cheese-colored fellow who was sitting there, to look up at us very suspiciously, and in a fierce tone of voice he said to me, "Boy, do you belong to that gentleman?" I quickly replied, "Yes, sir," which was quite correct. The tickets were handed out, and as my master was paying for them, the chief man said to him, "I wish you to register your name here, sir, and also the name of your nigger, and pay $1 duty on him." My master paid the $1, and pointing to the hand that was in the poultice, requested the officer to register his name for him. This seemed to offend the high-bred South Carolinian. He jumped up, shaking his head, and cramming his hands almost through the bottom of his trousers pockets, with a slave-bullying air, said, "I shan't do it." This attracted the attention of all the passengers. Just then the young military officer with whom my master traveled and conversed on the steamer from Savannah stepped in, somewhat the worse for brandy. He shook hands with my master, and pretended to know all about him. He said, "I know his friends like a book." And as the officer was known in Charleston, and was going to stop there with friends, the recognition was very much in my master's favor. The captain of the steamer, a good-looking, jovial fellow, seeing that the gentleman appeared to know my master, and perhaps not wishing to lose us as passengers, said in an offhand sailor-like manner, "I will register the gentleman's name, and take the responsibility upon myself." He asked my master's name. He said, "William Johnson." The names were put down, I think, Mr. Johnson and Slave. The captain said, "It's all right now, Mr. Johnson." He thanked him kindly, and the young officer begged my master to go with him, and have something to drink and a cigar. But as he had not acquired these accomplishments, he excused himself, and we went on board and came off to Wilmington, North Carolina. When the gentleman finds out his mistake, he will, I have no doubt, be careful in future not to pretend to have an intimate acquaintance with an entire stranger. During the voyage, the captain said, "It was rather sharp shooting this morning, Mr. Johnson. It was not out of any disrespect to you, sir, but they make it a rule to be very strict at Charleston. I have known families to be detained there with their slaves till reliable information could be received respecting them. If they were not very careful, any abolitionist might take off a lot of valuable niggers." My master said, "I suppose so," and thanked him again for helping him over the difficulty. We reached Wilmington the next morning, and took the train for Richmond, Virginia. I have stated that the American railway carriages, or cars, as they are called, are constructed differently to those in England. At one end of some of them, in the south, there is a little apartment with a couch on both sides for the convenience of families and invalids, and as they thought my master was very poorly, he was allowed to enter one of these apartments at Petersburg, Virginia, where an old gentleman and two handsome young ladies, his daughters, also got in, and took seats in the same carriage. But before the train started, the gentleman stepped into my car, and questioned me respecting my master. He wished to know what was the matter with him, where he was from, and where he was going. I told him where he came from, and said that he was suffering from a complication of complaints, and was going to Philadelphia, where he thought he could get more suitable advice than in Georgia. The gentleman said my master could obtain the very best advice in Philadelphia, which turned out to be quite correct, though he did not receive it from physicians, but from kind abolitionists who understood his case much better. The gentleman also said, "I reckon your master's father hasn't any more such faithful and smart boys as you." "Oh yes, sir, he has," I replied, "lots on 'em," which was literally true. This seemed all he wished to know. He thanked me, gave me a 10-cent piece, and requested me to be attentive to my good master. I promised that I would do so, and have ever since endeavored to keep my pledge. During the gentleman's absence, the ladies and my master had a little cozy chat, but on his return he said, "You seem to be very much afflicted, sir." "Yes, sir," replied the gentleman in the poultices. "What seems to be the matter with you, sir? May I be allowed to ask?" "Inflammatory rheumatism, sir." "Oh, that is very bad, sir," said the kind gentleman. "I can sympathize with you, for I know from bitter experience what the rheumatism is." If he did, he knew a good deal more than Mr. Johnson. The gentleman thought my master would feel better if he would lie down and rest himself, and as he was anxious to avoid conversation, he at once acted upon this suggestion. The ladies politely rose, took their extra shawls, and made a nice pillow for the invalid's head. My master wore a fashionable cloth cloak, which they took and covered him comfortably on the couch. After he had been lying a little while the ladies, I suppose, thought he was asleep, so one of them gave a long sigh and said, in a quiet, fascinating tone, "Papa, he seems to be a very nice young gentleman." But before Papa could speak, the other lady quickly said, "Oh, dear me, I never felt so much for a gentleman in my life." To use an American expression, they fell in love with the wrong chap. After my master had been lying a little while he got up, the gentleman assisted him in getting on his cloak, the ladies took their shawls, and soon they were all seated. They then insisted upon Mr. Johnson taking some of their refreshments, which of course he did, out of courtesy to the ladies. All went on enjoying themselves until they reached Richmond, where the ladies and their father left the train. But before doing so, the good old Virginian gentleman, who appeared to be much pleased with my master, presented him with a recipe, which he said was a perfect cure for the inflammatory rheumatism. But the invalid, not being able to read it, and fearing he should hold it upside down and pretending to do so, thanked the donor kindly, and placed it in his waistcoat pocket. My master's new friend also gave him his card, and requested him the next time he travelled that way to do him the kindness to call, adding, "I shall be pleased to see you, and so will my daughters." Mr. Johnson expressed his gratitude for the proffered hospitality, and said he should feel glad to call on his return. I have not the slightest doubt that he will fulfill the promise whenever that return takes place. After changing trains, we went on a little beyond Fredericksburg, and took a steamer to Washington. At Richmond, a stout elderly lady, whose whole demeanor indicated that she belonged, as Mrs. Stowe's Aunt Chloe expresses it, to one of the firstest families, stepped into the carriage, and took a seat near my master. Seeing me passing quickly along the platform, she sprang up as if taken by a fit, and exclaimed, "Bless my soul! There goes my nigger Ned." My master said, "No, that is my boy." The lady paid no attention to this. She poked her head out of the window and bawled to me, "You Ned, come to me, sir, you runaway rascal." On my looking round, she drew her head in and said to my master, "I beg your pardon, sir, I was sure it was my nigger. I never in my life saw two black pigs more alike than your boy and my Ned." After the disappointed lady had resumed her seat, and the train had moved off, she closed her eyes, slightly raising her hands, and in a sanctified tone said to my master, "Oh, I hope, sir, your boy will not turn out to be so worthless as my Ned has. Oh, I was as kind to him as if he had been my own son. Oh, sir, it grieves me very much to think that after all I did for him he should go off without having any cause whatever." "When did he leave you?" asked Mr. Johnson. "About 18 months ago, and I have never seen hair or hide of him since." "Did he have a wife?" inquired a very respectable-looking young gentleman, who was sitting near my master and opposite to the lady. "No, sir, not when he left, though he did have one a little before that. She was very unlike him. She was as good and as faithful a nigger as anyone need wish to have. But, poor thing, she became so ill that she was unable to do much work, so I thought it would be best to sell her, to go to New Orleans, where the climate is nice and warm." "I suppose she was very glad to go south for the restoration of her health," said the gentleman. "No, she was not," replied the lady, "for niggers never know what is best for them. She took on a great deal about leaving Ned and the little nigger, but as she was so weakly, I let her go." "Was she good-looking?" asked the young passenger, who was evidently not of the same opinion as the talkative lady, and therefore wished her to tell all she knew. "Yes, she was very handsome, and much whiter than I am, and therefore will have no trouble in getting another husband. I am sure I wish her well. I asked the speculator who bought her to sell her to a good master. Poor thing, she has my prayers, and I know she prays for me. She was a good Christian, and always used to pray for my soul. It was through her earliest prayers," continued the lady, "that I was first led to seek forgiveness of my sins before I was converted at the great camp meeting." This caused the lady to snuffle and to draw from her pocket a richly embroidered handkerchief and apply it to the corner of her eyes. But my master could not see that it was at all soiled. The silence which prevailed for a few moments was broken by the gentleman's saying, "As your July was such a very good girl, and had served you so faithfully before she lost her health, don't you think it would have been better to have emancipated her?" "No, indeed I do not," scornfully exclaimed the lady, as she impatiently crammed the fine handkerchief into a little work-bag. "I have no patience with people who set niggers at liberty. It is the very worst thing you can do for them. My dear husband, just before he died, willed all his niggers free. But I and all our friends knew very well that he was too good a man to have ever thought of doing such an unkind and foolish thing, had he been in his right mind, and therefore we had the will altered as it should have been in the first place." "Did you mean, madam," asked my master, "that willing the slaves free was unjust to yourself, or unkind to them?" "I mean that it was decidedly unkind to the servants themselves. It always seems to me such a cruel thing to turn niggers loose to shift for themselves, when there are so many good masters to take care of them. As for myself," continued the considerate lady, "I thank the Lord my dear husband left me and my son well provided for. Therefore I care nothing for the niggers, on my own account, for they are a great deal more trouble than they are worth. I sometimes wish that there was not one of them in the world, for the ungrateful wretches are always running away. I have lost no less than 10 since my poor husband died. It's ruinous, sir, but as you are well provided for, I suppose you do not feel the loss very much," said the passenger. "I don't feel it at all," haughtily continued the good soul, "but that is no reason why property should be squandered. If my son and myself had the money for those valuable niggas, just see what a great deal of good we could do for the poor, and in sending missionaries abroad to the poor heathen, who have never heard the name of our blessed Redeemer. My dear son, who is a good Christian minister, has advised me not to worry and send my soul to hell for the sake of niggers, but to sell every blessed one of them for what they will fetch, and go and live in peace with him in New York. This I have concluded to do. I have just been to Richmond and made arrangements with my agent to make clean work of the 40 that are left. Your son being a good Christian minister, said the gentleman, it's strange he did not advise you to let the poor Negroes have their liberty and go north. It's not at all strange, sir. It's not at all strange. My son knows what's best for the niggers. He has always told me that they were much better off than the free niggers in the north. In fact, I don't believe there are any white laboring people in the world who are as well off as the slaves. You are quite mistaken, madam, said the young man. For instance, my own widowed mother, before she died, emancipated all her slaves and sent them to Ohio, where they are getting along well. I saw several of them last summer myself. Well, replied the lady, freedom may do for your ma's niggers, but it will never do for mine, and plague them, they shall never have it. That is the word with the bark on it. If freedom will not do for your slaves, replied the passenger, I have no doubt your Ned and the other 9 Negroes will find out their mistake and return to their old home. Blast them, exclaimed the old lady with great emphasis. If I ever get them, I will cook their infernal hash, and tan their accursed black hides well for them. God forgive me, added the old soul, the niggers will make me lose all my religion. By this time the lady had reached her destination. The gentleman got out at the next station beyond. As soon as she was gone, the young southerner said to my master, what a d shame it is for that old whining hypocritical humbug to cheat the poor Negroes out of their liberty. If she has religion, may the devil prevent me from ever being converted. For the purpose of somewhat disguising myself, I bought and wore a very good second-hand white beaver, an article which I had never indulged in before. So just before we arrived at Washington, an uncouth planter, who had been watching me very closely, said to my master, I reckon, stranger, you are spiling that nigger of yon, by letting him wear such a devilish fine hat. Just look at the quality on it. The president couldn't wear a better. I should just like to go and kick it overboard. His friend touched him and said, don't speak so to a gentleman. Why not? Exclaimed the fellow. He grated his short teeth, which appeared to be nearly worn away by the incessant chewing of tobacco, and said, it always makes me itch all over, from head to toe, to get hold of every D nigger I see dressed like a white man. Washington is run away with spiled and free niggers. If I had my way I would sell every D rascal of way down south, where the devil would be whipped out on him. This man's fierce manner made my master feel rather nervous, and therefore he thought the less he said the better, so he walked off without making any reply. In a few minutes we were landed at Washington, where we took a conveyance and hurried off to the train for Baltimore. We left our cottage on Wednesday morning, the 21st of December, 1848, and arrived at Baltimore Saturday evening, the 24th of Christmas Eve. Baltimore was the last slave port of any note at which we stopped. On arriving there we felt more anxious than ever, because we knew not what that last dark night would bring forth. It is true we were near the goal, but our poor hearts were still as if tossed at sea, and as there was another great and dangerous bar to pass, we were afraid our liberties would be wrecked, and, like the ill-fated Royal Charter, go down forever just off the place we longed to reach. They are particularly watchful at Baltimore to prevent slaves from escaping into Pennsylvania, which is a free state. After I had seen my master into one of the best carriages, and was just about to step into mine, an officer, a full-blooded Yankee of the lower order, saw me. He came quickly up, and, tapping me on the shoulder, said in his unmistakable native twang, together with no little display of his authority, "Where are you going, boy?" "To Philadelphia, sir," I humbly replied. "Well, what are you going there for?" "I am traveling with my master, who is in the next carriage, sir." "Well, I calculate you had better get him out, and be mighty quick about it, because the train will soon be starting. It is against my rules to let any man take a slave past here, unless he can satisfy them in the office that he has a right to take him along." The officer then passed on and left me standing upon the platform, with my anxious heart apparently palpitating in the throat. At first I scarcely knew which way to turn, but it soon occurred to me that the good God, who had been with us thus far, would not forsake us at the 11th hour. So with renewed hope I stepped into my master's carriage, to inform him of the difficulty. I found him sitting at the farther end, quite alone. As soon as he looked up and saw me, he smiled. I also tried to wear a cheerful countenance in order to break the shock of the sad news. I knew what made him smile. He was aware that if we were fortunate, we should reach our destination at 5 o'clock the next morning, and this made it the more painful to communicate what the officer had said. But, as there was no time to lose, I went up to him and asked him how he felt. He said, "Much better," and that he thanked God we were getting on so nicely. I then said we were not getting on quite so well as we had anticipated. He anxiously and quickly asked what was the matter. I told him. He started as if struck by lightning and exclaimed, "Good heavens! William, is it possible that we are, after all, doomed to hopeless bondage?" I could say nothing, my heart was too full to speak, for at first I did not know what to do. However, we knew it would never do to turn back to the city of destruction, like Bunyan's mistrust and timorous, because they saw lions in the narrow way after ascending the hill difficulty, but press on, like noble Christian and hopeful, to the great city in which dwelt a few shining ones. So, after a few moments, I did all I could to encourage my companion, and we stepped out and made for the office. But how or where my master obtained sufficient courage to face the tyrants who had power to blast all we held dear, heaven only knows. Queen Elizabeth could not have been more terror-stricken, on being forced to land at the Traitors' Gate leading to the Tower, than we were on entering that office. We felt that our very existence was at stake, and that we must either sink or swim. But, as God was our present and mighty helper in this, as well as in all former trials, we were able to keep our heads up and press forwards. On entering the room, we found the principal man, to whom my master said, "Do you wish to see me, sir?" "Yes," said this eagle-eyed officer, and he added, "It is against our rules, sir, to allow any person to take a slave out of Baltimore into Philadelphia, unless he can satisfy us that he has a right to take him along." "Why is that?" asked my master, with more firmness than could be expected. "Because, sir," continued he, in a voice and manner that almost chilled our blood, "if we should suffer any gentleman to take a slave past here into Philadelphia, and should the gentleman with whom the slave might be traveling turn out not to be his rightful owner, and should the proper master come and prove that his slave escaped on our road, we shall have him to pay for. And therefore, we cannot let any slave pass here without receiving security to show, and to satisfy us, that it is all right." This conversation attracted the attention of the large number of bustling passengers. After the officer had finished, a few of them said, "Chit, chit, chit," not because they thought we were slaves endeavoring to escape, but merely because they thought my master was a slaveholder and invalid gentleman, and therefore it was wrong to detain him. The officer, observing that the passengers sympathized with my master, asked him if he was not acquainted with some gentleman in Baltimore that he could get to endorse for him, to show that I was his property, and that he had a right to take me off. He said, "No," and added, "I bought tickets in Charleston to pass us through to Philadelphia, and therefore you have no right to detain us here." "Well, sir," said the man, indignantly, "right or no right, we shan't let you go." These sharp words fell upon our anxious hearts like the crack of doom, and made us feel that hope only smiles to deceive. For a few moments perfect silence prevailed. My master looked at me, and I at him, but neither of us dared to speak a word, for fear of making some blunder that would tend to our detection. We knew that the officers had power to throw us into prison, and if they had done so, we must have been detected and driven back, like the vilest felons, to a life of slavery, which we dreaded far more than sudden death. We felt as though we had come into deep waters and were about being overwhelmed, and that the slightest mistake would clip asunder the last brittle thread of hope by which we were suspended, and let us down forever into the dark and horrible pit of misery and degradation from which we were straining every nerve to escape. While our hearts were crying lustily unto him, who is ever ready and able to save, the conductor of the train that we had just left stepped in. The officer asked if we came by the train with him from Washington. He said we did, and left the room. Just then, the bell rang for the train to leave, and had it been the sudden shock of an earthquake, it could not have given us a greater thrill. The sound of the bell caused every eye to flash with apparent interest, and to be more steadily fixed upon us than before. But, as God would have it, the officer all at once thrust his fingers through his hair, and in a state of great agitation said, "I really don't know what to do. I calculate it is all right." He then told the clock to run and tell the conductor to let this gentleman and slave pass, adding, "As he is not well, it is a pity to stop him here. We will let him go." My master thanked him and stepped out and hobbled across the platform as quickly as possible. I tumbled him unceremoniously into one of the best carriages and leaped into mine just as the train was gliding off towards our happy destination. We thought of this plan about 4 days before we left Macon, and as we had our daily employment to attend to, we only saw each other at night. So we sat up the 4 long nights talking over the plan and making preparations. We had also been 4 days on the journey, and as we traveled night and day, we got but very limited opportunities for sleeping. I believe nothing in the world could have kept us awake so long, but the intense excitement, produced by the fear of being retaken on the one hand, and the bright anticipation of liberty on the other. We left Baltimore about 8 o'clock in the evening, and not being aware of a stopping place of any consequence between there and Philadelphia, and also knowing that if we were fortunate, we should be in the latter place early the next morning, I thought I might indulge in a few minutes' sleep in the car. But I, like Bunyan's Christian in the Arbor, went to sleep at the wrong time and took too long a nap. So when the train reached Havre de Grace, all the first-class passengers had to get out of the carriages and into a ferry boat to be ferried across the Susquehanna River and take the train on the opposite side. The road was constructed so as to be raised or lowered to suit the tide. So they rolled the luggage vans onto the boat and off on the other side, and as I was in one of the apartments adjoining a baggage car, they considered it unnecessary to awaken me and tumbled me over with the luggage. But when my master was asked to leave his seat, he found it very dark and cold and raining. He missed me for the first time on the journey. On all previous occasions, as soon as the train stopped, I was at hand to assist him. This caused many slaveholders to praise me very much. They said they had never before seen a slave so attentive to his master, and therefore my absence filled him with terror and confusion. The children of Israel could not have felt more troubled on arriving at the Red Sea. So he asked the conductor if he had seen anything of his slave. The man, being somewhat of an abolitionist, and believing that my master was really a slaveholder, thought he would tease him a little respecting me. So he said, "No, sir, I haven't seen anything of him for some time. I have no doubt he has run away, and is in Philadelphia, free, long before now." My master knew that there was nothing in this, so he asked the conductor if he would please to see if he could find me. The man indignantly replied, "I am no slave hunter, and as far as I am concerned, everybody must look after their own niggers." He went off and left the confused invalid to fancy whatever he felt inclined. My master at first thought I must have been kidnapped into slavery by someone, or left, or perhaps killed on the train. He also thought of stopping to see if he could hear anything of me, but he soon remembered that he had no money. That night all the money we had was consigned to my own pocket, because we thought, in case there were any pickpockets about, a slave's pocket would be the last one they would look for. However, hoping to meet me some day in a land of liberty, and as he had the tickets, he thought it best upon the whole to enter the boat and come off to Philadelphia, and endeavor to make his way alone in this cold and hollow world as best he could. The time was now up, so he went on board and came across with feelings that can be better imagined than described. After the train had got fairly on the way to Philadelphia, the guard came into my car and gave me a violent shake, and bawled out at the same time, "Boy, wake up." I started, almost frightened out of my wits. He said, "Your master is scared half to death about you." That frightened me still more. I thought they had found him out, so I anxiously inquired what was the matter. The guard said, "He thinks you have run away from him." This made me feel quite at ease. I said, "No, sir, I am satisfied my good master doesn't think that." So off I started to see him. He had been fearfully nervous, but on seeing me he at once felt much better. He merely wished to know what had become of me. On returning to my seat, I found the conductor and 2 or 3 other persons amusing themselves very much respecting my running away. So the guard said, "Boy, what did your master want?" "2," I replied. "He merely wished to know what had become of me." "No," said the man, "that was not it. He thought you had taken French leave, for parts unknown. I never saw a fellow so badly scared about losing his slave in my life. Now," continued the guard, "let me give you a little friendly advice. When you get to Philadelphia, run away and leave that cripple and have your liberty." "No, sir," I indifferently replied, "I can't promise to do that." "Why not?" said the conductor, evidently much surprised. "Don't you want your liberty?" "Yes, sir," I replied, "but I shall never run away from such a good master as I have at present." One of the men said to the guard, "Let him alone. I guess he will open his eyes when he gets to Philadelphia, and see things in another light." After giving me a good deal of information, which I afterwards found to be very useful, they left me alone. I also met with a colored gentleman on this train, who recommended me to a boarding house that was kept by an abolitionist, where he thought I would be quite safe, if I wished to run away from my master. I thanked him kindly, but of course did not let him know who we were. Late at night, or rather early in the morning, I heard a fearful whistling of the steam engine. So I opened the window and looked out, and saw a large number of flickering lights in the distance, and heard a passenger in the next carriage, who also had his head out of the window, say to his companion, "Wake up, old hoss, we are at Philadelphia." The sight of those lights and that announcement made me feel almost as happy as Bunyan's Christian must have felt when he first caught sight of the cross. I, like him, felt that the straps that bound the heavy burden to my back began to pop, and the load to roll off. I also looked and looked again, for it appeared very wonderful to me how the mere sight of our first city of refuge should have all at once made my hitherto sad and heavy heart become so light and happy. As the train speeded on, I rejoiced and thanked God with all my heart and soul for his great kindness and tender mercy in watching over us and bringing us safely through. As soon as the train had reached the platform, before it had fairly stopped, I hurried out of my carriage to my master, whom I got at once into a cab, placed the luggage on, jumped in myself, and we drove off to the boarding house which was so kindly recommended to me. On leaving the station, my master, or rather my wife, as I may now say, who had from the commencement of the journey borne up in a manner that much surprised us both, grasped me by the hand and said, "Thank God, William, we are safe," and then burst into tears, leant upon me, and wept like a child. The reaction was fearful. So when we reached the house, she was in reality so weak and faint that she could scarcely stand alone. However, I got her into the apartments that were pointed out, and there we knelt down, on this Sabbath and Christmas Day, a day that will ever be memorable to us, and poured out our heartfelt gratitude to God for his goodness in enabling us to overcome so many perilous difficulties, in escaping out of the jaws of the wicked. Part Roman 2. After my wife had a little recovered herself, she threw off the disguise and assumed her own apparel. We then stepped into the sitting room and asked to see the landlord. The man came in, but he seemed thunderstruck on finding a fugitive slave and his wife, instead of a young cotton planter and his nigger. As his eyes traveled round the room, he said to me, "Where is your master?" I pointed him out. The man gravely replied, "I am not joking. I really wish to see your master." I pointed him out again, but at first he could not believe his eyes. He said he knew that was not the gentleman that came with me. But after some conversation, we satisfied him that we were fugitive slaves, and had just escaped in the manner I have described. We asked him if he thought it would be safe for us to stop in Philadelphia. He said he thought not, but he would call in some persons who knew more about the laws than himself. He then went out, and kindly brought in several of the leading abolitionists of the city, who gave us a most hearty and friendly welcome amongst them. As it was in December, and also, as we had just left a very warm climate, they advised us not to go to Canada, as we had intended, but to settle at Boston in the United States. It is true that the Constitution of the Republic has always guaranteed the slaveholders the right to come into any of the so-called free states and take their fugitives back to southern Egypt. But through the untiring, uncompromising, and manly efforts of Mr. Garrison, Wendell Phillips, Theodore Parker, and a host of other noble abolitionists of Boston and the neighborhood, public opinion in Massachusetts had become so much opposed to slavery and to kidnapping that it was almost impossible for anyone to take a fugitive slave out of that state. So we took the advice of our good Philadelphia friends and settled at Boston. I shall have something to say about our sojourn there presently. Among other friends we met with at Philadelphia was Robert Purves, Esq., a well-educated and wealthy colored gentleman who introduced us to Mr. Barclay Ivans, a member of the Society of Friends, and a noble and generous-hearted farmer who lived at some distance in the country. This good Samaritan at once invited us to go and stop quietly with his family, till my wife could somewhat recover from the fearful reaction of the past journey. We most gratefully accepted the invitation, and at the time appointed, we took a steamer to a place up the Delaware River, where our new and dear friend met us with his snug little cot, and took us to his happy home. This was the first act of great and disinterested kindness we had ever received from a white person. The gentleman was not of the fairest complexion, and therefore, as my wife was not in the room when I received the information respecting him and his anti-slavery character, she thought of course he was a quadroon like herself. But on arriving at the house and finding out her mistake, she became more nervous and timid than ever. As the cot came into the yard, the dear good old lady and her 3 charming and affectionate daughters all came to the door to meet us. We got out, and the gentleman said, Go in, and make yourselves at home. I will see after the baggage. But my wife was afraid to approach them. She stopped in the yard and said to me, William, I thought we were coming among colored people. I replied, It is all right, these are the same. No, she said, it is not all right, and I am not going to stop here. I have no confidence whatever in white people. They are only trying to get us back to slavery. She turned round and said, I am going right off. The old lady then came out, with her sweet, soft, and winning smile, shook her haughtily by the hand, and kindly said, How art thou, my dear? We are all very glad to see thee and thy husband. Come in to the fire. I dare say thou art cold and hungry after thy journey. We went in, and the young ladies asked if she would like to go upstairs and fix herself before tea. My wife said, No, I thank you, I shall only stop a little while. But where art thou going this cold night? Said Mr. Ivans, who had just stepped in. I don't know, was the reply. Well then, he continued, I think thou hadst better take off thy things and sit near the fire. Tea will soon be ready. Yes, come, Ellen, said Mrs. Ivans, let me assist thee, as she commenced undoing my wife's bonnet strings. Don't be frightened, Ellen, I shall not hurt a single hair of thy head. We have heard with much pleasure of the marvelous escape of thee and thy husband, and deeply sympathize with thee in all that thou hast undergone. I don't wonder at thee, poor thing, being timid, but thou needst not fear us. We would as soon send one of our own daughters into slavery as thee, so thou mayest make thyself quite at ease. These soft and soothing words fell like balm upon my wife's unstrung nerves, and melted her to tears. Her fears and prejudices vanished, and from that day she has firmly believed that there are good and bad persons of every shade of complexion. After seeing Sally Ann and Jacob, two colored domestics, my wife felt quite at home. After partaking of what Mrs. Stosmose and Pete called a busting supper, the ladies wished to know whether we could read. On learning we could not, they said if we liked they would teach us. To this kind offer, of course, there was no objection. But we looked rather knowingly at each other, as much as to say that they would have rather a hard task to cram anything into our thick and matured skulls. However, all hands set to and quickly cleared away the tea things, and the ladies and their good brother brought out the spelling and copy books and slates, etc., and commenced with their new and green pupils. We had, by stratagem, learned the alphabet while in slavery, but not the writing characters, and as we had been such a time learning so little, we at first felt that it was a waste of time for anyone at our ages to undertake to learn to read and write. But, as the ladies were so anxious that we should learn, and so willing to teach us, we concluded to give our whole minds to the work, and see what could be done. By so doing, at the end of the 3 weeks we remained with the good family we could spell and write our names quite legibly. They all begged us to stop longer, but, as we were not safe in the state of Pennsylvania, and also as we wished to commence doing something for a livelihood, we did not remain. When the time arrived for us to leave for Boston, it was like parting with our relatives. We have since met with many very kind and hospitable friends, both in America and England, but we have never been under a roof where we were made to feel more at home, or where the inmates took a deeper interest in our well-being than Mr. Barclay Ivans and his dear family. May God ever bless them, and preserve each one from every reverse of fortune. We finally, as I have stated, settled at Boston, where we remained nearly 2 years, I employed as cabinet maker and furniture broker, and my wife at her needle. And as our little earnings in slavery were not all spent on the journey, we were getting on very well, and would have made money, if we had not been compelled by the general government, at the bidding of the slaveholders, to break up business, and fly from under the stars and stripes to save our liberties and our lives. In 1850, Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Bill, an enactment too infamous to have been thought of or tolerated by any people in the world, except the unprincipled and tyrannical Yankees. The following are a few of the leading features of the above law, which requires, under heavy penalties, that the inhabitants of the free states should not only refuse food and shelter to a starving, hunted human being, but also should assist, if called upon by the authorities, to seize the unhappy fugitive and send him back to slavery. In no case is a person's evidence admitted in court in defense of his liberty when arrested under this law. If the judge decides that the prisoner is a slave, he gets $10, but if he sets him at liberty, he only receives 5. After the prisoner has been sentenced to slavery, he is handed over to the United States Marshal, who has the power, at the expense of the general government, to summon a sufficient force to take the poor creature back to slavery, and to the lash from which he fled. Our old masters sent agents to Boston after us. They took out warrants and placed them in the hands of the United States Marshal to execute. But the following letter from our highly esteemed and faithful friend, the Rev. Samuel May, of Boston, to our equally dear and much lamented friend, Dr. Estlin of Bristol, will show why we were not taken into custody. 21 Conhill, Boston, November 6, 1850. My dear Mr. Estlin, I trust that in God's good providence this letter will be handed to you in safety by our good friends, William and Ellen Croft. They have lived amongst us about 2 years, and have proved themselves worthy, in all respects, of our confidence and regard. The laws of this republican and Christian land tell it not in Moscow, nor in Constantinople, regard them only as slaves, chattels, personal property. But they nobly vindicated their title and right to freedom 2 years since by winning their way to it, at least so they thought. But now, the slave power, with the aid of Daniel Webster and a band of lesser traitors, has enacted a law which puts their dearly bought liberties in the most imminent peril, holds out a strong temptation to every mercenary and unprincipled ruffian to become their kidnapper, and has stimulated the slaveholders generally to such desperate acts for the recovery of their fugitive property as have never before been enacted in the history of this government. Within a fortnight, 2 fellows from Macon, Georgia, have been in Boston for the purpose of arresting our friends William and Ellen. A writ was served against them from the United States District Court, but it was not served by the United States Marshal. Why not, is not certainly known, perhaps through fear, for a general feeling of indignation, and a cool determination not to allow this young couple to be taken from Boston into slavery, was aroused and pervaded the city. It is understood that one of the judges told the marshal that he would not be authorized in breaking the door of Croft's house. Croft kept himself close within the house, armed himself, and awaited with remarkable composure the event. Ellen, in the meantime, had been taken to a retired place out of the city. The Vigilance Committee, appointed at a late meeting in Faneuil Hall, enlarged their numbers, held an almost permanent session, and appointed various subcommittees to act in different ways. One of these committees called repeatedly on Messrs. Hughes and Knight, the slave catchers, and requested and advised them to leave the city. At first they peremptorily refused to do so, till they got hold of the niggers. On complaint of different persons, these 2 fellows were several times arrested, carried before one of our county courts, and held to bail on charges of conspiracy to kidnap and of defamation in calling William and Ellen slaves. At length they became so alarmed that they left the city by an indirect route, evading the vigilance of many persons who were on the lookout for them. Hughes, at one time, was near losing his life at the hands of an infuriated colored man. While these men remained in the city, a prominent Whig gentleman sent word to William Croft that if he would submit peaceably to an arrest, he and his wife should be bought from their owners, cost what it might. Croft replied, in effect, that he was in a measure the representative of all the other fugitives in Boston, some 200 or 300 in number, that if he gave up, they would all be at the mercy of the slave catchers, and must fly from the city at any sacrifice, and that, if his freedom could be bought for 2 cents, he would not consent to compromise the matter in such a way. This event has stirred up the slave spirit of the country, South and North. The United States government is determined to try its hand in enforcing the fugitive slave law, and William and Ellen Croft would be prominent objects of the slaveholders' vengeance. Under these circumstances, it is the almost unanimous opinion of their best friends that they should quit America as speedily as possible and seek an asylum in England. Oh, shame, shame upon us, that Americans, whose fathers fought against Great Britain, in order to be free, should have to acknowledge this disgraceful fact. God gave us a fair and goodly heritage in this land, but man has cursed it with his devices and crimes against human souls and human rights. Is America the land of the free and the home of the brave? God knows it is not, and we know it too. A brave young man and a virtuous young woman must fly the American shores and seek, under the shadow of the British throne, the enjoyment of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But I must pursue my plain, sad story. All day long, I have been busy planning a safe way for William and Ellen to leave Boston. We dare not allow them to go on board a vessel, even in the port of Boston, for the writ is yet in the marshal's hands, and he may be waiting an opportunity to serve it. So I am expecting to accompany them tomorrow to Portland, Maine, which is beyond the reach of the marshal's authority, and there I hope to see them on board a British steamer. This letter is written to introduce them to you. I know you're in firm health, but I am sure, if you were stretched on your bed in your last illness, and could lift your hand at all, you would extend it to welcome these poor hunted fellow creatures. Henceforth, England is their nation and their home. It is with real regret for our personal loss in their departure, as well as burning shame for the land that is not worthy of them, that we send them away, or rather allow them to go. But with all the resolute courage they have shown in a most trying hour, they themselves see it is the part of a foolhardy rashness to attempt to stay here longer. I must close, and with many renewed thanks for all your kind words and deeds towards us, I am, very respectfully yours, Samuel May, Jr. Our old masters, having heard how their agents were treated at Boston, wrote to Mr. Fillmore, who was then President of the States, to know what he could do to have us sent back to slavery. Mr. Fillmore said that we should be returned. He gave instructions for military force to be sent to Boston to assist the officers in making the arrest. Therefore we, as well as our friends, among whom was George Thompson, Esq., late MP for the Tower Hamlets, the slave's long-tried, self-sacrificing friend and eloquent advocate, thought it best, at any sacrifice, to leave the mock-free republic and come to a country where we and our dear little ones can be truly free, no one daring to molest or make us afraid. But, as the officers were watching every vessel that left the port to prevent us from escaping, we had to take the expensive and tedious overland route to Halifax. We shall always cherish the deepest feelings of gratitude to the Vigilance Committee of Boston, upon which were many of the leading abolitionists, and also to our numerous friends, for the very kind and noble manner in which they assisted us to preserve our liberties and to escape from Boston, as it were like Lot from Sodom, to a place of refuge, and finally to this truly free and glorious country, where no tyrant, let his power be ever so absolute over his poor trembling victims at home, dare come and lay violent hands upon us, or upon our dear little boys, who had the good fortune to be born upon British soil, and reduce us to the legal level of the beast that perisheth. Oh, may God bless the thousands of unflinching, disinterested abolitionists of America, who are laboring through evil as well as through good report to cleanse their country's escutcheon from the foul and destructive blot of slavery, and to restore to every bondman his God-given rights. And may God ever smile upon England and upon England's good, much-beloved, and deservedly honored Queen, for the generous protection that is given to unfortunate refugees of every rank and of every color and clime. On the passing of the Fugitive Slave Bill, the following learned doctors, as well as a host of lesser traitors, came out strongly in its defense. The Rev. Dr. Gardner Spring, an eminent Presbyterian clergyman of New York, well known in this country by his religious publications, declared from the pulpit that, if by one prayer he could liberate every slave in the world, he would not dare to offer it. The Rev. Dr. Joel Parker, of Philadelphia, in the course of a discussion on the nature of slavery, says, "What, then, are the evils inseparable from slavery? There is not one that is not equally inseparable from depraved human nature in other lawful relations." The Rev. Moses Stewart, D.D., late professor in the Theological College of Andover, in his vindication of this bill, reminds his readers that many Southern slaveholders are true Christians, that sending back a fugitive to them is not like restoring one to an idolatrous people, that, though we may pity the fugitive, yet the Mosaic law does not authorize the rejection of the claims of the slaveholders to their stolen or strayed property. The Rev. Dr. Spencer, of Brooklyn, New York, has come forward in support of the Fugitive Slave Bill by publishing a sermon entitled The Religious Duty of Obedience to the Laws, which has elicited the highest encomiums from Dr. Samuel H. Cox, the Presbyterian minister of Brooklyn, notorious both in this country and America for his sympathy with the slaveholder. The Rev. W. M. Rogers, an Orthodox minister of Boston, delivered a sermon in which he says, "When the slave asks me to stand between him and his master, what does he ask? He asks me to murder a nation's life, and I will not do it because I have a conscience, because there is a God." He proceeds to affirm that if resistance to the carrying out of the fugitive slave law should lead the magistracy to call the citizens to arms, their duty was to obey and, if ordered to take human life, in the name of God to take it. And he concludes by admonishing the fugitives to hearken to the word of God and to count their own masters worthy of all honor. The Rev. William Crowell, of Waterfield, State of Maine, printed a Thanksgiving sermon of the same kind, in which he calls upon his hearers not to allow excessive sympathies for a few hundred fugitives to blind them so that they may risk increased suffering to the millions already in chains. The Rev. Dr. Taylor, An Episcopal clergyman of New Haven, Connecticut, made a speech at a union meeting, in which he deprecates the agitation on the law and urges obedience to it, asking, "Is that article in the Constitution contrary to the law of nature, of nations, or to the will of God? Is it so? Is there a shadow of reason for saying it? I have not been able to discover it. Have I not shown you it is lawful to deliver up, in compliance with the laws, fugitive slaves, for the high, the great, the momentous interests of those southern states?" The Right Rev. Bishop Hopkins of Vermont, in a lecture at Lockport, says it was warranted by the Old Testament, and inquires, what effect had the gospel in doing away with slavery? None whatever. Therefore, he argues, as it is expressly permitted by the Bible, it does not in itself involve any sin, but that every Christian is authorized by the divine law to own slaves, provided they were not treated with unnecessary cruelty. The Rev. Orville Dewey, D.D., of the Unitarian Connection, maintained in his lectures that the safety of the Union is not to be hazarded for the sake of the African race. He declares that, for his part, he would send his own brother or child into slavery, if needed to preserve the union between the free and the slaveholding states, and, counseling the slave to similar magnanimity, thus exhorts him, "Your right to be free is not absolute, unqualified, irrespective of all consequences. If my espousal of your claim is likely to involve your race and mine together in disasters infinitely greater than your personal servitude, then you ought not to be free. In such a case, personal rights ought to be sacrificed to the general good. You yourself ought to see this and be willing to suffer for a while, one for many. If the doctor is prepared, he is quite at liberty to sacrifice his personal rights to the general good. But, as I have suffered a long time in slavery, it is hardly fair for the doctor to advise me to go back. According to his showing, he ought rather to take my place. That would be practically carrying out his logic, as respects suffering a while, one for many. In fact, so eager were they to prostrate themselves before the great idol of slavery, and like Balaam, to curse instead of blessing the people whom God had brought out of bondage, that they bring up obsolete passages from the Old Testament to justify their downward course, overlooked, or would not see, the following verses, which show very clearly, according to the doctor's own textbook, that the slaves have a right to run away, and that it is unscriptural for anyone to send them back. In the 23rd chapter of Deuteronomy, 15th and 16th verses, it is thus written, "Thou shalt not deliver unto his master the servant which is escaped from his master unto thee. He shall dwell with thee, even among you, in that place which he shall choose in one of thy gates, where it liketh him best. Thou shalt not oppress him. Hide the outcast. Bewray not him that wandereth. Let mine outcasts dwell with thee. Be thou a covert to them from the face of the spoiler." Isaiah 3, "For the great majority of the American ministers are not content with uttering sentences similar to the above, or remaining wholly indifferent to the cries of the poor bondman, but they do all they can to blast the reputation, and to muzzle the mouths, of the few good men who dare to beseech the God of mercy, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the heavy burdens, and let the oppressed go free. These reverend gentlemen pour a terrible cannonade upon Jonah for refusing to carry God's message against Nineveh and tell us about the whale in which he was entombed, while they utterly overlook the existence of the whales which trouble their republican waters, and know not that they themselves are the Jonahs who threaten to sink their ship of state by steering in an unrighteous direction. We are told that the whale vomited up the runaway prophet. This would not have seemed so strange had it been one of the above lukewarm doctors of divinity whom he had swallowed, for even a whale might find such a morsel difficult of digestion. I venerate the man whose heart is warm, whose hands are pure, whose doctrines and whose life coincident exhibit lucid proof that he is honest in the sacred cause. But grace abused brings forth the foulest deeds, as richest soil the most luxuriant weeds. I must now leave the reverend gentleman in the hands of him who knows best how to deal with a recreant ministry. I do not wish it to be understood that all the ministers of the states are of the Balaam stamp. There are those who are as uncompromising with slaveholders as Moses was with Pharaoh, and, like Daniel, will never bow down before the great false god that has been set up. On arriving at Portland, we found that the steamer we intended to take had run into a schooner the previous night and was lying up for repairs, so we had to wait there, in fearful suspense, for 2 or 3 days. During this time, we had the honor of being the guest of the late and much lamented Daniel Oliver, Esq., one of the best and most hospitable men in the state. By simply fulfilling the scripture injunction to take in the stranger, etc. He ran the risk of incurring a penalty of $2,000 and 12 months imprisonment. But neither the fugitive slave law nor any other satanic enactment can ever drive the spirit of liberty and humanity out of such noble and generous-hearted men. May God ever bless his dear widow, and eventually unite them in his cots above. We finally got off to St. John's, New Brunswick, where we had to wait 2 days for the steamer that conveyed us to Windsor, Nova Scotia. On going into a hotel at St. John's, we met the butler in the hall, to whom I said, "We wish to stop here tonight." He turned round, scratching his head, evidently much put about, but thinking that my wife was white, he replied, "We have plenty of room for the lady, but I don't know about yourself. We never take in colored folks." "Oh, don't trouble about me," I said. "If you have room for the lady, that will do. So please have the luggage taken to a bedroom." Which was immediately done, and my wife went upstairs into the apartment. After taking a little walk in the town, I returned and asked to see the lady. On being conducted to the little sitting room, where she then was, I entered without knocking, much to the surprise of the whole house. The lady then rang the bell and ordered dinner for two. "Dinner for two, Mum?" exclaimed the waiter as he backed out of the door. "Yes, for two," said my wife. In a little while the stout, red-nosed butler, whom we first met, knocked at the door. I called out, "Come in." On entering, he rolled his whisky eyes at me and then at my wife and said in a very solemn tone, "Did you order dinner for two, Mum?" "Yes, for two," my wife again replied. This confused the chubby butler more than ever, and as the landlord was not in the house, he seemed at a loss what to do. When dinner was ready, the maid came in and said, "Please, Mum, the missus wishes to know whether you will have dinner up now, or wait till your friend arrives." "I will have it up at once, if you please." "Thank you, Mum," continued the maid, and out she glided. After a good deal of giggling in the passage, someone said, "You are in for it, butler, after all, so you had better make the best of a bad job." But before dinner was sent up, the landlord returned, and having heard from the steward of the steamer by which we came that we were bound for England, the proprietor's native country, he treated us in the most respectful manner. At the above house, the Boots, whose name I forget, was a fugitive slave, a very intelligent and active man, about 45 years of age. Soon after his marriage, while in slavery, his bride was sold away from him, and he could never learn where the poor creature dwelt. So after remaining single for many years, both before and after his escape, and never expecting to see again, nor even to hear from, his long-lost partner, he finally married a woman at St. John's. But poor fellow, as he was passing down the street one day, he met a woman. At the first glance they nearly recognized each other. They both turned round and stared, and unconsciously advanced, till she screamed and flew into his arms. Her first words were, "Dear, are you married?" On his answering in the affirmative, she shrank from his embrace, hung her head, and wept. A person who witnessed this meeting told me it was most affecting. This couple knew nothing of each other's escape or whereabouts. The woman had escaped a few years before to the Free States by secreting herself in the hold of a vessel, but as they tried to get her back to bondage, she fled to New Brunswick for that protection which her native country was too mean to afford. The man at once took his old wife to see his new one, who was also a fugitive slave, and as they all knew the workings of the infamous system of slavery, they could, as no one else can, sympathize with each other's misfortune. According to the rules of slavery, the man and his first wife were already divorced, but not morally, and therefore it was arranged between the three that he should live only with the lastly married wife, and allow the other one so much a week, as long as she requested his assistance. After staying at St. John's 2 days, the steamer arrived, which took us to Windsor, where we found a coach bound for Halifax. Prejudice against color forced me on the top in the rain. On arriving within about 7 miles of the town, the coach broke down and was upset. I fell upon the big crotchety driver, whose head stuck in the mud, and as he always objected to niggers riding inside with white folks, I was not particularly sorry to see him deeper in the mire than myself. All of us were scratched and bruised more or less. After the passengers had crawled out as best they could, we all set off, and paddled through the deep mud and cold and rain to Halifax. On leaving Boston, it was our intention to reach Halifax at least 2 or 3 days before the steamer from Boston touched there, en route for Liverpool, but having been detained so long at Portland and St. John's, we had the misfortune to arrive at Halifax at dark, just 2 hours after the steamer had gone. Consequently, we had to wait there a fortnight for the Cambria. The coach was patched up and reached Halifax with the luggage, soon after the passengers arrived. The only respectable hotel that was then in the town had suspended business and was closed, So we went to the inn, opposite the market, where the coach stopped. A most miserable, dirty hole it was. Knowing that we were still under the influence of the low Yankee prejudice, I sent my wife in with the other passengers to engage a bed for herself and husband. I stopped outside in the rain till the coach came up. If I had gone in and asked for a bed, they would have been quite full. But as they thought my wife was white, she had no difficulty in securing apartments, into which the luggage was afterwards carried. The landlady, observing that I took an interest in the baggage, became somewhat uneasy and went into my wife's room and said to her, "Do you know the dark man downstairs?" "Yes, he is my husband." "Oh, I mean the black man, the nigger?" "I quite understand you, he is my husband." "My God!" exclaimed the woman as she flounced out and banged to the door. On going upstairs, I heard what had taken place, but as we were there and did not mean to leave that night, we did not disturb ourselves. On our ordering tea, the landlady sent word back to say that we must take it in the kitchen or in our bedroom, as she had no other room for niggers. We replied that we were not particular and that they could send it up to our room, which they did. After the pro-slavery persons who were staying there heard that we were in, the whole house became agitated, and all sorts of oaths and fearful threats were heaped upon the D niggers for coming among white folks. Some of them said they would not stop there a minute if there was another house to go to. The mistress came up the next morning to know how long we wished to stop. We said a fortnight. "Oh, dear me, it is impossible for us to accommodate you, and I think you had better go. You must understand, I have no prejudice myself. I think a good deal of the colored people, and have always been their friend, but if you stop here we shall lose all our customers, which we can't do nohow." We said we were glad to hear that she had no prejudice, and was such a staunch friend to the colored people. We also informed her that we would be sorry for her customers to leave on our account, and as it was not our intention to interfere with anyone, it was foolish for them to be frightened away. However, if she would get us a comfortable place, we would be glad to leave. The landlady said she would go out and try. After spending the whole morning in canvassing the town, she came to our room and said, "I have been from one end of the place to the other, but everybody is full." Having a little foretaste of the vulgar prejudice of the town, we did not wonder at this result. However, the landlady gave me the address of some respectable colored families whom she thought, under the circumstances, might be induced to take us. And as we were not at all comfortable, being compelled to sit, eat, and sleep in the same small room, we were quite willing to change our quarters. I called upon the Rev. Mr. Kennedy, a truly good-hearted Christian man, who received us at a word, and both he and his kind lady treated us handsomely, and for a nominal charge. My wife and myself were both unwell when we left Boston, and having taken fresh cold on the journey to Halifax, we were laid up there under the doctor's care, nearly the whole fortnight. I had much worry about getting tickets, for they baffled us shamefully at the Cunard office. They at first said that they did not book till the steamer came, which was not the fact. When I called again, they said they knew the steamer would come full from Boston, and therefore we had better try to get to Liverpool by other means. Other mean Yankee excuses were made, and it was not till an influential gentleman, to whom Mr. Francis Jackson, of Boston, kindly gave us a letter, went and rebuked them, that we were able to secure our tickets. So when we went on board, my wife was very poorly, and was also so ill on the voyage that I did not believe she could live to see Liverpool. However, I am thankful to say she arrived, and after laying up at Liverpool very ill for 2 or 3 weeks, gradually recovered. It was not until we stepped upon the shore at Liverpool that we were free from every slavish fear. We raised our thankful hearts to heaven, and could have knelt down, like the Neapolitan exiles, and kissed the soil, for we felt that from slavery, heaven's shore had kept this spot of earth uncursed, to show how all things were created first. In a few days after we landed, the Rev. Francis Bishop and his lady came and invited us to be their guests, to whose unlimited kindness and watchful care my wife owes, in a great degree, her restoration to health. We enclosed our letter from the Rev. Mr. May to Mr. Estlin, who at once wrote to invite us to his house at Bristol. On arriving there, both Mr. and Miss Estlin received us as cordially as did our first good Quaker friends in Pennsylvania. It grieves me much to have to mention that he is no more. Everyone who knew him can truthfully say, "Peace to the memory of a man of worth, a man of letters, and of manners too? Of manners sweet as virtue always wears when gay good nature dresses her in smiles." It was principally through the extreme kindness of Mr. Estlin, the right Hon. Lady Noel Byron, Miss Harriet Martineau, Mrs. Reed, Miss Sturch, and a few other good friends, that my wife and myself were able to spend a short time at a school in this country, to acquire a little of that education which we were so shamefully deprived of while in the house of bondage. The school is under the supervision of the Mrs. Lushington, DCL. During our stay at the school, we received the greatest attention from everyone, and I am particularly indebted to Thomas Wilson, Esq., of Bradmore House, Chiswick, who was then the master, for the deep interest he took in trying to get me on in my studies. We shall ever fondly and gratefully cherish the memory of our endeared and departed friend, Mr. Estlin. We, as well as the anti-slavery cause, lost a good friend in him. However, if departed spirits in heaven are conscious of the wickedness of this world, and are allowed to speak, he will never fail to plead in the presence of the angelic host, and before the great and just judge, for downtrodden and outraged humanity. Therefore I cannot think thee wholly gone, the better part of thee is with us still. Thy soul its hampering clay aside hath thrown, and only Freya wrestles with the ill. Thou livest in the life of all good things. What words thou spak'st for freedom shall not die. Thou sleepest not, for now thy love hath wings to soar where hence thy hope could hardly fly. And often, from that other world, on this some gleams from great souls gone before may shine, to shed on struggling hearts a clearer bliss, and clothe the right with lustre more divine. Farewell, good man, good angel now. This hand soon, like thine own, shall lose its cunning too. Soon shall this soul, like thine, bewildered stand, then leap to thread the free, unfathomed blue. In the preceding pages, I have not dwelt upon the great barbarities which are practiced upon the slaves, because I wish to present the system in its mildest form, and to show that the tender mercies of the wicked are cruel. But I do now, however, most solemnly declare that a very large majority of the American slaves are overworked, underfed, and frequently unmercifully flogged. I have often seen slaves tortured in every conceivable manner. I have seen him hunted down and torn by bloodhounds. I have seen them shamefully beaten and branded with hot irons. I have seen them hunted and even burned alive at the stake, frequently for offenses that would be applauded if committed by white persons for similar purposes. In short, it is well known in England, if not all over the world, that the Americans, as a people, are notoriously mean and cruel towards all colored persons, whether they are bond or free. O tyrant, thou who sleepest on a volcano, from whose pent-up wrath, already some red flashes bursting up, beware. Preface having heard while in slavery that God made of one blood all nations of men, and also that the American Declaration of Independence says that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We could not understand by what right we were held as chattels. Therefore, we felt perfectly justified in undertaking the dangerous and exciting task of running 1,000 miles in order to obtain those rights which are so vividly set forth in the Declaration. I beg those who would know the particulars of our journey to peruse these pages. This book is not intended as a full history of the life of my wife, nor of myself, but merely as an account of our escape, together with other matter which I hope may be the means of creating in some minds a deeper abhorrence of the sinful and abominable practice of enslaving and brutifying our fellow creatures. Without stopping to write a long apology for offering this little volume to the public, I shall commence at once to pursue my simple story. W. Croft 12 Cambridge Road, Hammersmith, London. Running 1,000 Miles for Freedom by William Croft and Ellen Croft.